Welcome to the Spring Risk Conference webcast. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to when we can once again meet and enjoy the company of friends and peers. But for now, we're thankful to meet by means of webcast. Our risk conference will have two sessions, one today and one Thursday. The Utah State Bar has approved 5 hours of continuing legal education, and the Utah Insurance Department has approved 6 hours of CE for this conference. Please visit riskconference.net and provide your bar or license number to be sure that credit is recorded on your behalf. Please submit questions for the presenters through the feature Go to Webinar, and those will be addressed at the end of each speaker's remarks. Our first speaker this morning will be Dave Pitcher. Dave has been involved in casualty and insurance claims for many years. He has worked with insurance companies, independent adjusting firms, and for over 20 years has had responsibility for claims and risk management at UTA. He is currently the risk and claims manager for UTA with supervisory responsibility for an organization that provides transit services along the Wasatch Front and encompasses a service area of several million people. Dave is originally from Canada and served in the U.S. Armed Forces for 6 years. He has professional designations as an associate in risk management, public sector, and associate in claims. He is married with 5 children and has an extended family with grandchildren. He plays the bagpipe with the Salt Lake Scots Pipe Bag and is a part-time hockey coach with the BYU club hockey team. Dave's topic today is exceptional fleet safety.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Indeed we can.
Okay, thank you. And I hope you can see the screen all right. One of the concerns I had about doing this presentation was our fleet is quite a bit different than a lot of other fleets, but you know, fleet programs are not all uniform, and nor should they be. If I ask why this is, I think the reason's pretty obvious. Not all companies are the same, and not all fleets are the same. In fact, even within the same organization, there can be differences between fleets. For example, Utah Transit Authority has 2 different fleets of rail vehicles, light rail and commuter rail, 4 different fleets of buses, fixed route buses, rapid transit, flex, and paratransit buses, and 4 other fleets of vehicles, including maintenance, facilities, police vehicles, and staff vehicles. Each of these fleets has differences due to regulations and standards that are determined by federal, state, and local governments, as well as various professional organizations. Legal precedents that are determined by case law governing operations, standards of care, accountabilities, special exposures to loss because of the environment in which each fleet operates. For example, law enforcement operates in a very different environment than paratransit vehicles operate in, or rail system operates in. Also, the differences are in special equipment and cargo. UTA transports the public, so we're concerned about passenger capacity, ski operations, and rail operations. And of course, there are differences in the types of drivers. We have police officers operating in our system. We have drivers with CDLs, and then we have just regular staff. Regardless of the variety of differences in fleets and how they operate, all fleet safety programs have several things in common. They should all be designed to prevent accidents, protect drivers, employees, and the organization, provide safe and appropriate equipment to accomplish its purpose, hold drivers and employees and the organization accountable, and follow the laws and regulations that apply to fleet's operations. An effective fleet safety program must be comprehensive, up-to-date, and instituted as part of your organization's safety culture. It should be thorough, reaching each employee who gets behind the wheel. And the commitment to safety, as in any application of risk management, has to start at the top. I'm sure that most of your organizations already have many of the following elements, but the American National Standards Institute and the American Society of Safety Engineers has a great resource in its Z15.1 standard for safe practices for motor vehicle operations. This standard encompasses the elements that any fleet safety program should have, and we'll talk in more detail about each of these, but these essential elements include management policies. As mentioned, leadership support for the program can help assure that the program is used and can avoid unnecessary exposures unique to the organization. Management support is essential in the development of an effective program and sets clear, concise expectations. UTA is regularly audited by the FTA, the Federal Transit Administration. One of the primary focuses of this audit is the development of and compliance with the Transit Agency Safety Plan. Much of this plan encompasses fleet safety programs for UTA's various fleet operations, and this has to be supported by upper management. It's critical to have as much control as possible over the interaction between the driver, the vehicle, and the environment in which they operate together, be able to be effectively monitor that interaction. Proper driver management can help create a reliable, safe team. Without good practices in recruiting and training safe drivers, no organization is likely to have a good long-term safety record. This is where the rubber meets the road. While human error is responsible for most accidents, keeping the fleet maintained and moving can have a profound effect on the organization's productivity. And as vehicles move closer and closer to full autonomy, this area will become more critical to safe operations. This is the monitor and review step in the risk management cycle of a fleet safety program and provides information on trends and hazards that might need to be addressed in other elements of the program. So let's look at management policies for a minute. Why should management be involved in fleet safety? Well, we've already talked about a few, but probably the biggest reason is that they are responsible for the allocation of staff and financial resources to make the program effective. And since this is the case, they also need to be aware of the exposures to the organization from an ineffective fleet safety program. Some of these exposures are listed here. As you look these over, think about which ones are priorities for your organization. For UTA, these are perhaps the ones that stand out the most. Allegations of hiring poor drivers and negligent hiring practices is a tough one because we hire a lot of drivers and spend a lot of time and money training them for their CDL. There are periods of time when commercial drivers are in high demand in the private sector, which draws good drivers away from UTA and makes the selection process for good drivers much more difficult. Probably the most critical for us is our public image. If the public doesn't have confidence in the safety of the public transit system, fewer and fewer people will ride it. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, UTA is audited by the Federal Transit Administration, so our compliance with safety standards is critical. So what should be addressed in management policies? Establishing what the responsibilities are for the fleet and who is responsible will ensure that the program is communicated throughout the organization. It will also encourage compliance with the program and improvements and deficiencies. Organizational safety rules establish the expectation that drivers comply with the organization's vehicle safety program. It also makes drivers aware that their primary responsibility while driving is the safe operation of the vehicle. These safety rules can be in a standalone fleet safety policy or can be incorporated into the organization's overall safety program. Where the fleet requires no specialized training, those allowed to use the fleet should be oriented to the safety rules of the organization. Where specialized training is involved, all new drivers should be trained on equipment of similar size, power, configuration, and operation as the vehicle that they will be using prior to being assigned that vehicle. Training should include behind-the-wheel observation if a CDL or other special license is required to operate the vehicle. In order to have an effective fleet, it's important to have the right vehicles for the job. At UTA, we need to meet the needs of passengers for a variety of transportation services. For example, UTA purchases larger and more comfortable MCI buses for routes that require longer commutes. These buses have high back seats that are more comfortable and have overhead storage bins. For paratransit vehicles, we have buses with specialized wheelchair lifts and more secure restraint systems. And obviously, for our police vehicles, they require light bars, sirens, push bars, partitions, stowage, radios, etc. Failing to get the vehicle specifications right not only affects the effectiveness of the organization's use of the fleet, but can also affect safety. Maintaining the fleet is also critical. Back in the 1970s, it was much before my time at UTA, back when UTA was a new transit agency, vehicles were breaking down frequently in the system. Public confidence in UTA's reliability hurt ridership numbers. UTA's response was to institute a robust preventative maintenance program, which resulted in very few breakdowns and subsequent increase in ridership. Regular inspections can also save money by identifying problems early so they can be taken care of before they result in expensive repairs or expensive safety issues. Safety incentive programs can be effective if done properly. This actually could be an entire presentation on its own, but there's plenty of data to support some form of safety incentive, particularly where the reward is based on behavior rather than a rate-based program. Where driving is the employee's job, there should also be consequences for poor behavior. These consequences might be retraining on that particular behavior, or might rise to the level of suspension or termination if the safety violation is serious enough. As the program matures, the results of the effectiveness of the program will need to be looked at by management in order to make sure that it's keeping up with industry standards. And where it isn't, adjustments will need to be made to the program. While management sets the tone for the program, the operational environment is where the driving takes place. As mentioned before, it's the interaction between the driver, the vehicle, and the environment in which they operate. The organization should establish policies regarding what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior for drivers when they are behind the wheel, as well as effectively managing the risks they face on the road. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, comes up with an annual top 10 most wanted improvements in transportation safety. Since the NTSB covers aviation, rail, and marine, some of its top 10 are not applicable to this discussion, but the first three items on the list, on my list, are on the NTSB's top 10. In spite of evidence of increased safety with seatbelt usage, this continues to be a problem nationally. Every fleet should have a policy regarding the use of seatbelts. Among drivers and front-end passengers, seatbelt usage can reduce the risk of death by 45% and cut the risk of serious injury by 50%. Seat belts prevent drivers and passengers from being ejected during a crash, and people not wearing a seat belt are 30 times more likely to be ejected from the vehicle. I often hear people ask about seatbelt usage on buses. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which oversees school bus operations, does not require seatbelts on school buses weighing over 10,000 pounds, but for lighter school buses, seatbelts are required. The FTA, the Federal Transit Administration, which oversees public transit, does not require seatbelt usage in transit operational situations. I think there's a couple reasons. Number one, a study was conducted of public transit passengers in 4 major US cities on buses where seatbelts were provided, and only 1% of passengers made use of the seatbelts. So it's an expense that people aren't going to take advantage of. Number two, a seatbelt is of most use where a collision causes rapid deceleration. Bus collisions rarely experience those kinds of forces because they're so large. When I first started at UTA back in 1996, I investigated a fatal accident where a large SUV suddenly crossed the center line and collided head-on with one of our buses. Both vehicles were traveling at about 40 miles per hour at the point of impact, so about an 80 mile per hour closing speed. There were 9 passengers on our bus. The collision killed both occupants of the SUV and it seriously injured our driver. But the most serious bus passenger injuries were a broken nose and some soft tissue sprains and strains, which likely would have happened even if seatbelts were being used. This area covers several important issues. Driving impaired is the NTSB's #1 priority. Every day, 28 people are killed in alcohol-related collisions. While the impairment of alcohol and its effects on driving have been studied extensively, impairment by other drugs, both legal and illegal, haven't been studied as much and pose other concerns. Marijuana, for example, offers a different challenge as it becomes legal in more and more states. It can be smoked or ingested with much greater potency in terms of its active ingredient, THC, than it was when it was illegal. So what constitutes impairment when ingesting or taking marijuana? And what constitutes a cutoff point in marijuana use before operating a motor vehicle? The drug also affects people differently in terms of their behavior. And as I mentioned before, it packs more of a punch today. Then, of course, there's the opioid crisis, perhaps a far scarier drug in terms of impaired driving. These drugs are dangerous because they're prescribed by a doctor, so many think they're okay and that they're not at risk of addiction. But opioids can be very dangerous. Fatigue driving is another area of concern when it comes to driver condition. In a 24/7 society with an emphasis on work, longer commutes, and exponential advancement of technology, many people do not get the sleep they need. This can be a difficult one to monitor in a fleet unless you have cameras that show the driver. Perhaps the best way to deal with this in a fleet is to educate and provide tips to avoid drowsy driving and how to recognize the warning signs of fatigue and effective strategies for managing fatigue. Medical issues are also difficult to monitor. With drivers who operate under a CDL, they're required to submit to a medical exam at least every 24 months. But it's been my experience that even with the exam, medical conditions can cause accidents. Probably one of the most common medical conditions affecting driving is sleep apnea, which also ties into fatigue driving. If drivers are having problems with drowsy driving, this should probably be checked. Anything that draws your attention away from operating the vehicle is a distraction. When you're driving, you should be focused on getting from point A to point B in the safest way you can. Among high-risk driving behaviors, combating distracted driving needs to have a high priority. With so many distractions present in the operational environment, safety professionals and fleet managers must ensure that their workers do not become distracted on the road and take their mind off the task of driving. Of course, the hot topic in this area is cell phone usage. It's estimated that 40% of all cell phone calls take place while at least one of the parties is in a moving vehicle. The National Safety Council reports that cell phone use while driving leads to 1.6 million crashes each year. I'm going to show you a quick video clip. And hold on. So I want you to, I want you to notice the driver and what the driver is doing here, and how it affects his driving on the road. He starts to wander a bit. See, at one point he takes both hands off the wheel. You'll see the bus kind of wander over the bicycle lane. So did everybody see that video okay? I hope it showed up.
Yeah, looks great.
Okay. You should know that UTA has a very strict policy with regards to cell phone usage while driving. Even so, as you've seen in this video clip, sometimes the temptation is just too much. We require drivers to not only put cell phones away, but to turn them off. The only time drivers can use their cell phones is when they're holding at the end of their routes or in the case of an emergency. And all our operators have radios, UTA radios on board, so there's no reason really for them to use their cell phones at all when they're communicating with UTA. Of all cell phone related tasks, texting is by far the most dangerous. Nearly 390,000 injuries occur each year from accidents caused by texting while driving. 1 out of every 4 car accidents in the United States is estimated to be caused by texting and driving. Texting while driving causes 400% increase in the time spent with your eyes off the road. And texting while driving, this was surprising to me, but texting while driving is 6 times more likely to cause an accident than driving drunk. Aggressive driving is becoming a bigger issue on the highway. High-risk driving behaviors include, but are not limited to, speeding, tailgating, failure to signal a lane change, running red lights and stop signs, weaving in and out of traffic, yelling, making obscene gestures, excessive use of the horn, and other aggressive behaviors. I've got another video clip that I want to show here. And this one, I'm just going to pause it right here. This one is from the dash cam of my own personal vehicle. So these are clips that I've pulled from just driving in on Utah roadways. What I want you to pay attention to in this first clip is this semi-truck that's in a right-hand turn only lane. And obviously this truck is a fleet vehicle. And this silver passenger car here, as he cuts through the intersection, he forces that silver car over into the oncoming left turn lane. In this video clip, I want you to pay attention to this white pickup truck. Now this pickup truck is, it belongs to a business. The business is a roofing company, so this is also a fleet vehicle. This is southbound just past the point of the mountain on I-15 when all the construction was going on. At least the guy signals. I have to give him that. Watch what he does here. Whoop. A little bit of a dangerous maneuver. And this one I'm headed northbound on I-15 near Farmington. Notice that there's no license plates on this guy's car and there's no tag in the window. Northbound here on Bangerter in South Jordan. And here comes a car passing me in the emergency lane, and then it continues on and weaves in and out of traffic. So that's just a sample of some of the aggressive driving that you see on the roads these days. And two of those were fleet vehicles that belonged to a company that probably would have been interested in taking a look at those video clips. On a periodic basis, drivers should receive information and training regarding the impact of risky and aggressive driving on safe vehicle operations. Along with managing driver behavior, another critical element is managing the journey. With the recent pandemic, options have become available to have meetings and interactions with clients and coworkers online without the need to drive to other locations. Fleet managers should look at these options to avoid additional trips where possible. If driving is necessary, drivers need to assess the hazards and risks associated with a particular route and adjust their driving behavior accordingly. This assessment should account for factors such as traffic conditions, weather conditions, and road construction. I've got another video clip to show you here. Now, I'm just going to pause it here real quick. So this driver drives this route regularly, and obviously it's a snowy day. It's hard to tell from this video, but this is he's going downhill and into a curb. So I was able to get him to bleep out all the profanity, but anyway, this operator was aware of what the conditions were like before he started on the route, should have adjusted his driving behavior in accordance with the weather conditions. On fixed routes, being aware of these conditions is important, but even in situations where the route isn't set in advance, weather and road conditions are important considerations. Another thing that fleet managers should be aware of and should consider policies for is with regards to the business use of personal vehicles, the personal use of business vehicles, and rental vehicle usage. Those should be considered in a fleet safety policy as well. So studies have shown again and again that your drivers are your biggest exposure. And although our vehicles are safer than ever before, human error is responsible for 94% of crashes according to the National Safety Council. Good drivers in your fleet begin with the hiring process, and the hiring process begins with establishing driver qualifications. Where driving is an important part of the job description should be clear as to what qualifications are required and expected of your drivers. This can help screen unqualified drivers from the applicant pool. The hiring process should include a check of the MVR, the motor vehicle record. Every driver comes with a history, and you need to know what that history is. Obtain MVRs for anyone who drives on behalf of your company. You hire and train the best drivers possible, but you cannot be with your drivers all the time. The fleet safety program best protects the organization when small issues are identified and corrected before they become larger issues. So monitoring driver performance is important. Let's see. Driver assessment and training. I've combined these two together because good driver assessment leads to better focused training. No matter what the job is, we all tend to fall into bad habits which develop over time as we try to take shortcuts to accomplish our tasks. Driving is no different. Driver assessment should identify weaknesses that need additional emphasis in ongoing training. Review MVRs regularly to be sure drivers meet your standards. Apply your MVR policy consistently with all driving employees. At UTA, we have a special phone line for customers to call in their concerns to keep track, so that we can keep track of complaints and commendations from third parties. Over time, these can help identify safe drivers and those who might need ride-alongs or additional training. You should conduct ride-alongs where the manager or supervisor can observe driving behavior and document any unsafe habits they observe over the course of the trip. For UTA, being a public transit agency makes ride-alongs easier to conduct both with and without the driver's awareness of being observed. The manager or supervisor can then discuss these observations and corrective actions with the driver. Another thing, onboard computers and telematic devices can provide evidence of speed, aggressive acceleration, hard braking, and cornering. As you've noticed from the clips that I've shown, all of UTA's buses are equipped with smart drive cameras, which record and save aggressive driving events, including forces on the vehicle that exceed a certain threshold. So the cameras have actuators in them. They're constantly recording, but when an event occurs, they save 10 seconds prior to the activation and 10 seconds after the activation. And those events then are saved for later review so that operations supervisors and managers can use these events to coach drivers on poor driving behavior. I'm going to show another clip here real quick. And just want you to observe some of the problems that this driver had. The light's yellow. She enters on a red light. And she negotiates the left turn without paying attention to oncoming traffic. So obviously there are several behaviors in this one that this operator needed to be coached on. Record keeping is important. Organization records on drivers should include information collected as part of driver assessment and training, including ongoing training and updates to MVRs and licenses. As with driver management, vehicle management begins with the selection of the vehicle for the job. As I mentioned before, vehicles should be acquired based on suitability of the vehicle for the designated task, purpose and load, as well as the comfort and ease of use of the driver. One of the emphasis seen more and more with the NHTSA is increased implementation of collision avoidance technologies. The Society of Automotive Engineers identifies 6 levels of vehicle automation, and these have been adopted by the US DOT. I think we're going to see more and more of an emphasis on fleet safety will be reliant on automation in the future. So where we've seen in the past that most accidents are caused by human error, I think in the future we're going to see that more and more drifting towards the problems with the vehicles. All modifications to fleet vehicles need to be reviewed and approved in advance to make sure they won't hinder safe vehicle operations. Some of these vehicle modifications might include navigation systems, stereo equipment, window tinting, security systems, accessibility aids, cargo containment systems or racks for securing the load, changes in body configuration, etc. where UTA allows bus wraps. And you can see from this photo that this bus is wrapped in a rather unique way. This isn't one of our buses, but I came across this and thought it was pretty imaginative. Advertisers are always looking for clever ways to attract the public's attention. Sometimes bus wraps and advertising can be a challenging modification. We had an advertiser once who wanted to put a reflective advertisement, which acted like a mirror on the back of one of our buses. And of course, we couldn't allow that to happen, but we get inquiries like that from time to time. Of course, vehicles should be equipped with appropriate emergency equipment in the event the driver experiences mechanical difficulty, loss or shifting of the load, or a crash on the road. These things might include a first aid kit, flashlight, reflective safety vest, light sticks, reflective triangles and flares, flat tire repair, cold weather emergency items, and even food and water. Inspection and preventative maintenance practices ought to be approached in an organized manner so that any defects or wear and tear can be addressed early on before they lead to a breakdown or accident. Knowing when to replace a vehicle can be just as important as maintaining it. Criteria should be established for pulling the trigger on vehicle replacement. Some of the factors that might be a consideration in that criteria are the total mileage of the vehicle, the maintenance costs and frequency on that vehicle, the condition of the vehicle, operational requirements, operating environment, hours of service, or safety of the vehicle. Inevitably, accidents and incidents will happen within a fleet. Preparation and training in anticipation of these events can make the process a lot more smooth and less stressful on both the organization and the driver. Reporting of accidents and incidents should be done as soon as possible, normally within 24 hours. Fleets should require that even the most minor accidents or incidents be reported. The driver may think that the incident is so minor that nothing will come of it, but it's been my experience in my years of handling claims that even where no damage was done and everyone says they're okay at the time of the accident, a claim could still arise. And without proper reporting, evidence that could have been helpful could be lost. Knowing the what, where, when, and how of an accident could provide information that might prevent a worse situation from occurring in the future. Reporting the most minor accidents will help drivers be better prepared for the possibility of a larger event and could reveal gaps in the organization's process for gathering this information. The objective of incident review and analysis is to identify the root cause and contributing factors that led to the incident. Finding these out will lead to better corrective and preventative actions. The level of review and corrective measures tied to the accident might be based on the monetary cost of the incident, the severity of the accident, or the behavior causing the accident. UTA's current accident review policy is based almost solely on accident severity, but is currently undergoing a revision which will also take into account driver behavior. For example, if a driver runs a red light and causes an accident, regardless of the severity of the accident, the running of the red light is a serious safety violation. More and more with onboard camera, video, and telematics, accident review and analysis is much easier, particularly where there are disputes between parties as to what exactly happened. I've got a couple video clips here to show you where there were disputes over what happened in the accident. In this first one, the dispute was over who crossed the center line. So the other party in that one felt the bus crossed the center line, but obviously from the video that wasn't the case. In this accident, the dispute was over the color of the traffic signal. So you can see right here, the color of the traffic light is green. And at the time of the collision, the light is still green. There we go. All information gathered on an accident or incident should be used to determine if it was preventable. If it was preventable, corrective action should be implemented and documented. These might include driver retraining, or if it's a problem with the vehicle, adjustment to vehicle maintenance. Organizations should use any available data sources to assess safety performance, such as your loss history, benchmarking against industry standards, data from incident management services, and tracking devices and event data recorders. Incident and injury rates should be used to measure the historical frequency of incidents, collisions, and injuries. Rates should be clearly identified by the type of event and operational characteristics. These rates can then be used to benchmark against industry standards. A search on the internet can provide sources of fleet data that you can benchmark against. So, in summary, an audit of your current fleet safety efforts against an existing standard like the ANSI Z15.1 can help identify areas for potential improvement. And once you've completed the audit, you can make it a priority to follow up on any deficiencies that have been discovered. I want to thank you all for your attention, and I'm happy to try and answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Dave. Really appreciate it. A couple of questions came in. The first one is on telematics monitoring. I wonder if you could just take a moment and comment on some of these telematics systems and if UTA has implemented them or is looking at implementing more of them.
Sure. So our bus and rail vehicles all have what you might call a black box on board, and those can be accessed and can help determine speed, braking, those types of things. On all of our vehicles, we also have video cameras. And on our buses back, I think it was in, can't remember when we got them, but we installed a system called Smart Drive. There are several different onboard camera telematic combination devices that you can look at. We looked at Smart Drive and another one called DriveCam. But those cameras or those devices have a camera that, as you could see from the clips that I showed, have front view out of the bus and a back view into the bus so that you can see the bus operator. We've been using it for quite a few years now, and the actuators inside that camera will actually trigger events. So you might wonder how we caught that bus operator who was looking at his cell phone. Well, when he was drifting, he would grab the steering wheel and pull the bus back into the lane of travel. And just that movement triggered an event and captured 20 seconds of video of him messing around with his cell phone. So those events are uploaded to the network once those buses pull into the yard. And then all of those events are reviewed by Smart Drive and captioned, and then those are sent to UTA. We have their software that allows us to look through the captured events, and some of those behaviors are rated higher than others and have a higher priority than others. And so those are then sent to the operator supervisor so that those operators can be coached on those behaviors. So in this case where the guy was using a cell phone, it's likely the discipline was much harsher than just a coaching session with him. But those are the telematics that we've got on our vehicles.
Thank you so much. One other question came in, wondering if you would comment on safety planning around road construction.
Sure. So our supervisors, well, UDOT's pretty good about making us aware of where construction is, and our supervisors will go out and scout out the route, our normal route, and see if there needs to be a detour put in place. And if so, our buses will detour around those construction areas. In a lot of cases, though, the way the construction is being handled allows adequate room for our buses to maneuver through those areas.
All right. Well, thank you again, Dave. We really appreciate you taking the time this morning to give this presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. Our next presenter is Scott Tajak. Scott is the Director of Premises Pollution for Severson Ridge Environmental Underwriters. He has over 29 years of experience in the environmental industry, including many years as an environmental insurance underwriter, and in a consulting role working with the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers on various projects. Scott's going to take a few minutes today and review some of the hidden liabilities from environmental risk. With that, I will turn the time over to Scott. Looks like we're still muted.
Good morning. How are you doing today?
Doing great.
Great. Is the slides up?
Yep, everything looks like it's good to go.
Okay, great. Good morning, everybody. Today's topic is hidden liability from environmental risks. So our agenda today is why is environmental risk insurance not taken seriously, in my opinion? What is a pollutant and pollution incident? Known environmental risks at water-related entities, hidden environmental risk at water-related entities. Does the comprehensive GL insurance program provide coverage for pollution? What are the shortfalls of relying on pollution coverage via comprehensive GL insurance program? And reasons to consider purchasing full-size pollution policies. And of course, conclusion and question and answer. Okay, hold on a second. Okay, the biggest reason that commercial and public entity insurance buyers are uninsured for environmental risk, in my opinion, is that many insurance risk managers are unable to easily explain to their board members the effects of pollution exclusions on their comprehensive GL policies and the resulting need for environmental insurance in a convincing manner. One of the reasons for this is the continued belief that, the only thing that is excluded is hazardous waste, and as we'll find out, that's not necessarily the case. Often insurance agents, brokers who have limited understandings of these matters but are concerned nonetheless will push to have limited pollution coverage added to the GL policy. However, is this enough? So what is water-related entity for this discussion? For this discussion, it's meant for water districts, sewer districts, irrigation districts, community service districts, reclamation districts, special districts, and park districts if they have entities that have water reservoirs, water storage, beach management, or wetlands conservation lands under their ownership, operation, or management. So what is a pollutant? The GL definition of a pollutant is any solid, liquid, gaseous, or thermal irritant or contaminant, including smoke, vapor, soot, fumes, acids, alkalis, chemicals, and waste. Waste includes materials to be recycled, reconditioned, or reclaimed. In the monolite environmental world, the definition of pollutant is much broader. It's any solid, liquid, gaseous, or thermal irritant or contaminant, including smoke, vapors, soot, fumes, acids, alkalis, chemicals. And here's where it's different. It includes hazardous substances, petroleum hydrocarbons, low-level radioactive material and waste, medical and infectious or pathological waste, waste materials, electromagnetic EMFs, Legionella pneumophila, and microbial matter. And microbial matter includes mold and mildew. For whatever reason, I apologize. There's a box that keeps on popping up here that's interfering with the presentation. Okay. So what is a pollution incident? The discharge, emission, seepage, migration, dispersal, release, or escape of any pollutant into or upon land, or any structure on land, the atmosphere, including indoor air, or any water course or body of water, including groundwater, provided such conditions are not naturally present in the environment of the concentration or amounts discovered. The thing is pollution incidents can also include non-hazardous things like food grade materials, milk, rum, whiskey, clean soil, sand. Who would think just dirt on a hill could be considered pollutant? River, creek sediment, or like in California, chlorinated potable drinking water could be considered a pollutant. So before we start into more details about pollution and GL policies, etc., I wanted to give you just perspective of two claims I'm aware of that are non-hazardous in nature, just to make one realize it doesn't always have to be highly hazardous to be considered pollutant. One that I'm personally dealt with is in March 2014. I visited a site that manufactured soap, and during their clean out, they normally would clean their equipment, and their equipment would, all that water would be collected in a container and then dispersed of to an external removal firm. But for whatever reason, they had a new worker who didn't realize that. He just hosed it down, including 200 gallons of non-hazardous blue dye into a floor drain, which went right out the back and drained right into a creek and contaminated 2 miles of a creek through people's backyards. Even though it was non-hazardous, non-toxic, it still caused over $100,000 in environmental claims because the banks of the creek turned blue, and the property owners insisted that their property was damaged because of the blue staining. In addition, they had to prove to all those people that were impacted that in fact the chemical was non-hazardous. So soil samples had to be taken, sediment samples had to be taken, and for something as simple as 200 gallons of non-hazardous blue dye that is used in cooking, or in this case soap, 100K seems quite excessive, but it did happen. And this other one is more just to give a perspective. It is an older claim, but it's real. You could go to the internet and look it up on Google. There's plenty of discussions about this one. A fire in Madison, Wisconsin burned down a dairy warehouse. 6 stories of butter melted. I know it sounds ludicrous, but in reality, these things sometimes happen. But look at what happened with the fires and all this stuff seeping out and going into creek and damaging, filling up storm drains. It was so bad, 3,000 citizens were evacuated, including 200 residents from nursing home. The amount of business interruption losses was significant. As I understood, it burned for 2 days, and the cleanup took weeks. The estimated damage for that type of claim was $50 million for the whole caboodle. The biggest thing here is people ended up in a hospital smelling the burned cheese smoke because it's very accurate smoke. But so this is just to give you a little perspective. That pollution doesn't have to be the high hazard stuff that we typically think. So what are the known environmental risks for water-related entities? Most of you are probably aware of these already, so I'm not going to spend too much time, but sewer backups, overflows, odor complaints for sewer gas and methane fumes, clarifier settling tank failures with sludge and sewage spills, sewer and water main breaks, lateral breaks, vehicle accidents, spilled and spilled cargo, like if you're using a vac truck that takes a clover leaf too fast and spills over, turns over, upside overturn, contractor excavation accidents, chlorine gas liquid disinfection releases, third-party business interruption caused by pollution incidents, fuel releases from active underground storage tanks. These things are the things that most water-related entities feel that that's what they're getting coverage for. But there's so much more environmental exposure that most people just don't realize that they have. And most of these pollution incidents are really third-party claims focused claims. So what are some of the hidden environmental risks for water-related entities? Fuel and waste oil underground storage tank releases at water and park entity facility equipment and vehicle maintenance facilities. I see this almost every single account that I look at. And these releases are usually discovered when the decision has been made to replace the older garage buildings and put or expand new buildings on those spots. And when they start doing the development, they dig up the tank and they realize the tank's been leaking. Oops, sorry. I apologize. Oversensitive finger here. Okay. So fuel and waste oil releases from loading and unloading at district-owned facilities, including a emergency generator locations. A drip or drab filling a generator or a car is not typically reportable because typically it has to be a certain volume before you have to report to the regulatory parties. However, over 15, 20 years of drips and drabs, it is likely that soil is contaminated at those locations. It's common. Most above ground storage tanks have to be stored in bunkered areas that can hold up to 110% of the largest tank in that pool of tank in that location where tanks are stored. That's called tank containment. A lot of times there's tank containment failures because these tank storage areas are often outdoors. When rain collects in those secondary containment units, they take up space that is supposed to be there in the event of spill. 3-4 times a year, environmental carriers will see claims where the containment fails because storm water is allowed to collect in these units. Mercury spills from old metering equipment left in equipment boneyards that contaminate the soil, air, and groundwater. Mercury spills are is a very toxic chemical that requires the fire department and hazmat teams to come out immediately, and they're very costly to clean up. Leaded pipe and old asbestos water or sewer piping sections in equipment boneyards. It used to be very common for certain types of water pipe to have asbestos in them to prevent the pipe from cracking. The thing is as material becomes old, it leaves residuals on the ground that can, over time, can contaminate the soil. Leaded paint in soil at base of potable drinking water tanks. So often, water tanks are in the past were painted with leaded paint. Now, that issue's maybe not really be an issue to third-party bodily injury or so much if the area is fenced off. And a lot of the districts that I look at, they have fencing, but in some that's not the case. And the other thing is I've seen a lot of late where tanks are taken down and the properties are sold to be redeveloped as residential areas. If those areas are the area where the soil was not cleaned up or investigated whether there was lead in it, there could be a lead paint exposure for third parties. For kids that end up playing in those areas if the areas have been converted over to a different land use. Some other things, water-related entities waste disposal of third-party owned waste disposal sites. Even if you transfer your waste to a third-party site, transfer the liability, sell it, recycle it, if that other third party doesn't manage your waste well into the regs, or they go belly up and there's no way to address however the disposal method is, the federal US EPA could go back to the original generators of the waste, even decades later, and require you to clean them up. It's a very strict liability that you just can't get away from. So as in our industry, what they say is when it talks about waste, hazardous waste disposal, you're talking from cradle to grave. You can't really get out of the responsibility if something goes wrong at the end cycle. Mold, indoor air and vapor intrusion into water-related headquarter locations, satellite offices. Yes, most of the GL coverages will deal with providing third-party coverage. But what about your own workers? What about third-party visitors to visit your office facilities? Or if any of your office facilities, for those of you, some of you that might have larger facilities where you own a larger building and you have other tenants. What about those tenants if there's a mold issue on site? Third-party bodily injury from Legionella. Legionella is a bacteria. It causes Legionnaire's disease, similar to like pneumonia. It's caused from a variety of different things that deal with stagnation of water. So an HVAC system, condensation failures, bacteria-laden splash from stagnant water that's in a truck equipment wash service. And the reason I mentioned that is some public entities, including water entities that have large truck fleets, might have their own truck wash services equipment. Coolant tower exposures. Again, for those districts that have your own office, multi-story office buildings, coolant towers. You could, in New York City a few years ago, they had a major outbreak related to coolant towers. So there is new guidance in how to address Legionella when it comes to coolant towers, but also even park district sprinkler cisterns or from stagnant park ponds. Kids touch the water, they put it to their face, they can potentially get the Legionella bacterium. Silt and sediment contamination from dam failure. A good example of this is Ameren Energy out of St. Louis had a facility that generated electricity where they built a reservoir on top of a very large mountain. Well, not maybe as large as the Rocky Mountain, but what's common in Missouri. And unfortunately, due to a sensor failure, the reservoir filled up with too much water. A wall was undermined, and in literally, from what I understand, a minute, something like 6 billion gallons of water rushed down into a valley for 6 miles. It scoured the entire side of that mountainside of all the way down to rock, and any soil, clean soil, this is because it was a wildlife area, clean soil was placed downstream and went through a variety of third-party owned property. And the state and the feds considered that pollution, that clean soil that came from the mountain, as a pollutant, and they had to clean it up. It was, from what I understood, it was over $15 million in cleanup to physically go in there with trucks and tractors and remove all that soil and then take it to other places. Natural resource damages is where a pollution incident impacts resources. Now, natural resource damages is not controlled by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency or a state environment. It's related to a law from the Department of Interior where it just says that if you damage a resource to the water or a wetland area, we're going to assess you a fine for that damage. And there's a certain formula on how they do that. So that's in addition to any cleanup you might have. And first party business interruption from pollution condition. What if your facility has to be shut down because of a pollution condition that prevents your workers from getting to your location? Or or because you have an actual break or breach on site and you have lost revenues because of the impact, where you have to maybe buy water from another district because your facility is not, your water treatment plant's not running. So there are other things like historical pollution incidents. They're under building foundation. They're found when you expand or replaced or demolished. Here's a few examples I've seen in the last 10 years. Plant expansion built over historic sludge landfills. Parks built over former sludge disposal lagoons. Just saw that recently. Recycling facility transfer stations built on sludge landfill buffer land or even regular buffer land. There's also things you pick up in the ground from prior owners you acquire through purchases, eminent domain, tax default, donations, or will to your organization. And also, we've seen many, especially seen quite often in California, where offsite sources migrate, cause migration and contamination through water-related entities. Just a few more here. This is a big one. Every single one of the water entities I've seen in the last year have this exposure. And that's where if you have a water main break or a lateral break or a sewer main break, and you have to remove the pipe and replace it, the soil is taken out of the pit to get to the pipe to fix it. And typically nowadays, usually clean fill material aggregate is laid before the new pipe's put in, and then the soil's filled back into the hole. But oftentimes, the amount of soil that's put into taken out of the hole doesn't go back into the hole, and there's a pile of soil left behind. And where does it go? Oftentimes put on a dump trunk and taken off to one of your sites and put on a site for future use. The thing is a lot of times those areas, those easements where your pipes run, have to the right and to the left of them have industrial commercial properties, gas stations, dry cleaners, machine shops, etc. And if they had any pollution at all that contaminated the soil that flowed through the area where your pipe was, that soil could potentially be contaminated if not tested. And I have knowledge and I've seen claims that have been paid because entities took the waste, the soil, thinking it was clean, and took it back to the site only to contaminate their property. Liquid gaseous chemical releases used to treat the water from underground process tanks or pipelines over a gradual period of time. Like, the biggest issue that I've seen is any of the chemicals or compounds involving chlorine because of its toxicity and smell, fluoride, anhydrous ammonia, sulfuric acids. I took a random look, and these are the 4 contaminants that have the most frequency. Air emission scrubber failure on some of your methane reduction equipment at some of your wastewater treatment facilities. You use scrubbers to get rid of the odors. So sometimes, I've seen 2 instances where lime was used, and because it's under pressure, a gasket blew and the lime was spread as a dust and migrated by wind downstream from the site half a mile, and everything got coated with lime. Although it was not highly toxic, there were still people that were impacted because of asthma and dust-related allergies. And on top of everything had to be washed and cleaned. So, and of course, one of the biggest environmental risks for pollution is defense expense. Specialized legal services are needed on environmental claims, and they're long duration claims. Typically, cleanups don't take just for a lot of situations, especially if it gets into the soil or into the groundwater, it may take 3 to 5 years or more to clean up. So there's a lot of hidden costs associated with defense in dealing with environmental claims. So do general liability policies offer complete coverage? No. Comprehensive general liability policies water regulating typically offer very limited pollution coverage via exclusion exceptions, such as bodily injury third-party bodily injury claims from pollution released from an HVAC system. So heating, air conditioning, hot water tank system, etc. Bodily injury or property damage claims from a hostile fire, unless the hostile fire originated from a premise, site, or location handling waste, or a site or location where their insured or subcontractors are performing remediation, investigating for pollutants, etc. So bodily injury, third-party bodily injury property damage claims, which occurs or takes place as a result of your operations, can be provided, provided the bodily injury or property damage is not otherwise excluded in a whole or part and arises out of the following would be covered. Potable water where you supply to others, chemicals you use in your water and wastewater treatment processes, natural gas, propane gas you use in your processes, the application of pesticides or herbicides, if authorized and it meets regulatory requirements, fuels, lubricants, and operating fluids necessary to make your equipment work, or in vehicles designed to hold such chemicals, and as long as it's not intentionally discharged. So third-party bodily injury and property damage arising out of actual alleged threatened discharge, dispersal, seepage, migration, release, or escape of pollutants if such bodily injury or property damage is sudden and accidental, neither expected nor intended by an insured. However, there's just no coverage under this for petroleum underground storage tanks. We'll discuss that a little bit later about petroleum. Bodily injury or third-party property damage if such is caused by the escape or backup of sewage or wastewater from any sewage treatment plant or piping, but only if the property damage occurs away from land you own or lease. Please take note of that. Away from land you own or lease. What about your land that you lease? What about the land you operate on? There's no coverage. So carriers will often, in select cases, offer cleanup cost coverage on exception of the pollution exclusion by endorsement as follows. And this is just an excerpt, and this is just an example of a 2-day event where third-party bodily injury or property damage arising out of a 2-day pollution event, including any cleanup associated with the event, provided that it would not have taken place but for a named peril having occurred and you notified as soon as practicable, but no more than 14 days after its ending. However, this subparagraph does not limit any coverage to the extent that such coverage is specifically provided elsewhere. This exclusion only applies if the discharge is accidental, unintended, and stopped as soon as possible. It could be a 2-day, it could be a 3-day, it could be a 5-day, it could be a 10-day, and I've even seen in some cases 30-day. With the reporting aspect being out to 30-day or 45-day at the extreme. So cleanup costs, so optional. Take a step back here. Cleanup costs means expenses for the removal or neutralization of pollutants. This is what the GL policy has it read as: expenses for the removal or neutralization of pollutants. Who covers the investigation costs? Not the GL carrier. It's only for the expenses for the removal or neutralization of pollutants. And named peril means lightning, windstorm, earthquake, explosion, implosion, collapse, puncture, bursting, rupture, collision, or overturn of a tank, a vessel, machinery, equipment, or other similar apparatus or device, including any attached piping, pumps, or valves. If the explosion, implosion, collapse, puncture, bursting, rupture, collision, or overturn is not caused by deterioration, corrosion, erosion, decay, rotting, or wear and tear. The important thing to keep in mind is what I have underlined there is not caused by deterioration, corrosion, erosion, decay, rotting, or wear and tear. I know every district that I have looked at on an underwriting basis has a maintenance O&M plan they implement every year, a certain amount of work to keep their equipment up and running as efficiently and in as good a shape as possible within their budgets they have. It's a big chore. So if a pipe deteriorates, and I live in a community where we seem to have a lot of water main breaks, due why? Age, corrosion, decay. You know, under this program, there's no coverage for cleanup. If those situations arise, the company is bearing the brunt of those exposures, those cleanup things, cleanup events themselves, because it would be negated by this wording. So some of the pollutant GL exclusions that do exist on the form is there's a lead exclusion, an asbestos exclusion, fungi, mold, and bacteria exclusions, communicable disease exclusions, silica exclusions, and on top of it, typically there's an exclusion that says if a government files a claim ordering sampling, investigation, and cleanup, coverage would be excluded in most cases as well. So here are some, in my opinion, some of the shortcomings of buying pollution coverage through a GL policy. First off, third-party cleanup costs of pollution conditions from named perils with time element triggers is only on a sudden and accidental basis only. You know, the thing is with time element triggers, no matter what the number of days is, that's fine for those unexpected, unattended, sudden events, like a tank, lightning hits a tank and causes a tank to rupture. I mean, I get, that makes sense for those, but so many environmental claims happen over longer stretches of time, especially if the leak location is underground, within vessels or structures where the incident itself does not manifest itself instantly. In these cases where leaks may exceed the set number of days, there would be no coverage. Under a monoline pollution policy, where gradual coverage is offered, it alleviates the concern that, well, what is covered, what is not covered in terms of the trigger. If the named perils from deterioration, corrosion, erosion, decay, rotting, or wear and tear, there is no cleanup coverage under the GL policy. There's no first-party trigger for cleanup costs. So that's an important thing here. The thing is if you have pollution on your own site, you don't have the right to raise the flag and file a claim for the cleanup of your site because an accident happened on your own site. Limited pollution coverage often excludes claims for loss from damages if government agents files a claim or suit against them. This is significant because most releases are required to be reported to environmental agencies. These agencies often demand investigations and remediation, and if you don't tell them and they find out from some other source, they may fine you because you didn't affirmatively volunteer that you had these issues. Many exclusions in the policy can nullify the environmental coverage offered under other exclusion exceptions. GL policies do not cover unknown pre-existing pollution incidents. So what happened if something unknown was spilled in the past at the site and it was discovered today when you decided to build a new building on site? GL would not respond to that type of policy, that type of pollution incident. GL policies exclude coverage at third-party owned waste disposal sites. When a pollution incident happens, an insured must wait for the carrier to decide whether the pollution claim will be covered or not. The carriers must decide whether any other exclusions will avoid coverage under an exception. Is the claim sudden, accidental, was something leaking for 2 days, 10 days? What if it's not known? If a spill was gradual over a longer duration beyond the time element or not from a named peril, then no coverage may exist. Just what most risk managers do not want, uncertainty of whether coverage really exists or not. So here are some reasons to consider purchasing a monoline site pollution policy. It provides contract certainty of coverage as environmental policies utilize insurance agreements to state what is affirmatively covered. Insurance agreements available in the marketplace include first and third-party cleanup costs from unknown pollution incidents, third-party bodily injury and property damage from unknown pollution incidents for new and pre-existing conditions, third-party bodily injury, property damage, and cleanup costs for unknown pollution incidents at non-owned waste disposal facilities, third-party BI, property damage, and cleanup costs for pollution incidents from goods and cargo that are upset and overturned via transportation by first and third-party carriers. So for that one, related transportation coverage, we're not covering if you get into an accident, your fuel tank on the vehicle leaks. It's the car. If the chemicals, sewage are being transported as a good and there's a spill, that's what we're covering. The other insuring agreement I don't have listed here, my mistake for not entering it, is you also could get in many cases first party business interruption coverage as an insuring agreement. So here's something to keep in mind about cleanup costs. We mentioned cleanup costs earlier, what's on a GL policy, but what is typically on a site pollution policy is this definition of cleanup costs. Cleanup costs means reasonable necessary expenses, including restoration costs and legal expenses incurred with our prior written consent, which consent shall not be unreasonably withheld or delayed to investigate, abate, contain, treat, remove, remediate, monitor, or dispose of soil, surface water, groundwater, other contaminant media, but only to the extent required by law for those costs actually incurred by the government for which you are legally liable for in the absence of A and B above to the extent recommended by an environmental professional. That last part has to do with mold, Legionella, and similar, where most jurisdictions don't have environmental regulations for, but they are pollutants nonetheless, and we rely on environmental professionals to help assess what's safe for human health and environment. As a reminder, what it was on a GL policy, cleanup costs means expenses for the removal or neutralization of pollutants. That's it. No investigation costs are included. No restoration costs are included. It's so much more is provided in providing a fuller process for under cleanup than a GL policy will ever respond. So here's some other things why a monoline pollution policy should be considered. Legal defense expense is within the policy limits, with most carriers offering a certain amount of defense outside the limits. Usually no more than 25% can be had outside the limits. It doesn't mean that you just have that 25% outside the limits. That comes back into, and you can use whatever full amount of limits, aggregate limits that's available. Coverages for sudden, accidental, and gradual coverage. So you don't have to worry about how many days that the spill event has been happening. Sometimes, especially when stuff's underground, nobody really can tell how long it's occurred. It takes the ambiguity of gradual or not is removed by the all-encompassing coverage afforded. Coverage includes, in most cases, mold and fungi and Legionella. Coverage includes the removal of meth lab chemicals and the cleanup of resultant pollution left in, say, a pump house or shed by vandals. I see this nowadays, unfortunately, in our society of 1 in 5 or 6 districts that I look at have had a problem with this, because those pump houses or sheds or abandoned, or I should say, underutilized facilities that used to be used by a district. They're still owned by the district, but the equipment's not being used, where people take advantage of those situations to do nefarious things, like set up these meth labs. Meth lab chemicals are very highly hazardous chemicals, and specialized removal folks have to come in and address those, and they could be quite costly. Coverage also includes affirmative midnight dumping, illicit abandonment, cleanup costs. Again, districts have a tendency to have water pump houses and sewer lift stations a little everywhere in every type of setting. Easy spots for people to leave, their asbestos, citizens leave their asbestos tile, renovation debris, or other types of waste at these facilities. The policy would cover the disposal, picking up and making arrangements for disposal for those types of pollution, those dumps. Coverage includes catastrophe management, environmental public relations support for pollution incidents to aid in ensure during an environmental crisis. Especially for water and wastewater districts, if there's a major upset at a major plant, there are more important things for plant managers to be worried about, like getting up the system up and running, to be able to pull in a specialist that will be able to handle the media, will be able to handle the questions or attorneys that deal with bodily injury from environmental and pollution claims. Prevent is a great benefit to take that pressure off a plant manager who just wants to get his plant up and running again. Coverage includes an affirmative first-party emergency cleanup cost at the start of a pollution incident. So you can immediately contact emergency responder and get that emergency crisis taken care of ASAP. Coverage in the form is also afforded via endorsement for the following: green restoration costs, use of environmentally friendly materials as part of restoration of pollution incident within offices. So, to replace old-fashioned plasterboard with, green materials. Mold and fungus coverage in office occupancies. A lot of water and wastewater districts that do have underground storage tanks may utilize the state tank fund to get the required federal financial responsibility coverage for those tanks. We have the capability to sit excess over either the state tank funds or a tank policy to provide additional limit capacity for exposures not covered by those two mechanisms. We also have most carriers also have access to being able to offer financial responsibility tank coverage as well on a separate policy basis. We could go, typically carriers will look at going excess over a GL auto on excess policies to allow pollution coverage afforded in those policies to be primary, so that some limits of coverage can be used first, often without a retention. I know most insurance and risk managers have told me that they like taking advantage of those little sublimits that are provided under those other policies first, because in most cases there's no response first dollar, whereas an environmental policy will have a deductible or a retention that will apply. There's coverage for electromagnetic fields, silt, sediment, low-level radioactive waste. In most cases, these types of things are not covered by GL policies. Coverage for third-party bodily injury property and from known pollution conditions that may still exist at a site that's been cleaned up and certified by an environmental agency as not needing any further action. So if you're a district that has had an underground storage tank that had a leak and they cleaned it up to the best of their abilities, but some residual of contaminants were left on site because it's under a building, and you couldn't remove it without damaging the structural integrity of the building, the state will offer, say, okay, nothing more is further required, and no further letter is put on file. And we'll provide the environmental carriers will take a look, and if they were comfortable, we'll provide coverage for third-party bodily property damage from those known pollution conditions that exist on that site, which is something a GL policy would never accommodate. So policies are also available for up to 3-year policy terms for this niche. Why is that compared to most other policies in the GL, worker comp, property? Everything's on an annual basis. Why in environmental can we offer that? Well, for us, for environmental business, claims are not frequency driven. Rather, they're severity driven. That's the reason we can offer a long term. The thing is when you do a longer term, the aggregate limit is shared over that policy term. We don't reinsert annually in that regard. Most water-related entities, in my opinion, purchase limits of 1 million to 5 million in limits. Larger entities can purchase limits up to $25 million in capacity, but 95% of the ones I've seen in the last 5 years have been 5 million and less. The industry uses surface lines, non-emitted forms, primarily because we often customize manuscript endorsements to fit the individual needs of each entity. So in conclusion, there are many environmental risks associated with water-related entities. Not all are readily acknowledged by the water-related entity industry, in my opinion. Unfortunately, entities often have blinders on by concentrating on only third-party bodily injury property damage claims due to the threat of lawsuits and public relations concerns. However, cleanup costs are almost never fully covered by general liability policy due to the number of overlapping exclusions and small sublimits of coverage. If the focus is only third-party claims, that leaves first-party claims to be uninsured or underinsured by water-related entities. First-party claims that are uninsured can result in sizable remediation costs that will fully be the responsibility of the entities and then customers who will have to foot the bill via increased rates. Property policies may pay contaminated building materials damaged by a hostile fire or other covered loss under a debris removal coverage. However, property policy will never respond to clean up of soil groundwater, which is often a much larger cost than debris removal. And since most of my discussion was on GL and that property, I just felt it was important to put that in there, that there is a little bit of coverage, but soon as the word hits that the soil or groundwater has to be cleaned up, usually property policy clamp down and won't extend the coverage. Standalone environmental policies offer the broadest affirmative coverage, pollution coverage. Knowing you have such coverage in place when an incident happens allows one not to worry whether its GL carrier will or will not cover the incident. It didn't pass through all the exclusions that may nullify the very limited cover. So just a quick tidbit of Severn Ridge Environmental Underwriters. We're managing general underwriters and environmental programs. We just started up this year a new water entity scheduled location pollution legal liability program for water and wastewater entities, the entities I referenced earlier. We're backed by Allied World Assurance Company, AM Best A15 credit rating. We also offer contractor pollution liability for industrial contractors that specialize in managing, doing O&M, water-related entities for districts. We do contracting pollution liability for trade and general contractors and flood and fire restoration contractors. Now it's time for some questions. I thank you for all of your time and this opportunity.
Thanks, Scott. Really appreciate it. I do have a couple of questions that came in.
Sure.
The first is it possible to get coverage for toxic mold or sick buildings?
Toxic mold or sick buildings. Yes, mold coverage is available. Now, if the mold or the mold is in a processing area of a water or a water-related entity, typically carriers won't provide coverage for those areas where, like lift stations, where or the processing areas, because the water and bacteria and mold is pervasive everywhere, just because of the nature of the material that's being handled. But in an office, apartment, commercial setting, mold coverage and indoor air pollution coverage is readily available from the marketplace. Just about every environmental carrier will offer the coverage. There are residents, residential homes is most carriers will not offer coverage in that space. And right now, hospitality and medical facilities are much more difficult to get that full-blown mold coverage these days, just because of a lot of claims that people are suffering. It is still available, but it's much more restrictive, and the underwriting process is a lot more difficult. We will not cover a known mold exposure. Our coverage is meant for unknown pollution conditions, unknown mold. But that being said, if a mold issue happened in a building and cleanup was done and was certified by a environmental professional that it was addressed and fully cleaned up, we would not negate coverage for that. We would close out that particular claim. Basically, that particular incident would be excluded, but any new incidents in that location would be offered, a coverage would be offered for that.
Okay, another question is, do environmental claims, or do many environmental claims arise from actions of regulators, and are fines covered?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Most environmental carriers' policies exclude criminal fines, criminal penalties, criminal assessments, but nothing other than criminal. So yes, insurance carriers will pay fines. We will not pay punitive damages unless it's required by law to do so. But civil fines, fees, and penalties, that is something that insurance carriers will cover from time to time. The exclusion is specific to criminal in the exclusion portion of the policy.
Okay, and one more. Can you get coverage for silica or toxic dust?
So that's interesting. With environmental policies, site policies, there is no silica exclusion. For asbestos and lead-based paint, there's an exclusion if it's tied to a building or structure, but if it's in the groundwater and third-party BI and PD from it for bodily injury and property damage, third-party bodily is not excluded, nor is excluded if it's in the soil or groundwater. But if it is attached to a building, we won't cover asbestos or asbestos dust. In terms of toxic dust, I mean, there's so many different things that could cause dust, whether it be a metal or fine. There's no specific exclusion for those. The policies exclude known pollution conditions, that basically what the risk manager or the responsible manager for the insured that deals with environmental matters would acknowledge as being known. But again, in certain situations where there are known issues that have been addressed and have been certified by regulatory entities that the issues have been resolved, or environmental professional, we will give reopener coverage for those scenarios if the problem reappears due to different occurrence.
Okay, and looks like the last question. Will an environmental policy cover special cleanup that may be necessary from a biological event or a pandemic?
At times it would. Yes, it would. And the thing is, you know, in terms of COVID and viruses and that, it depends upon the carrier, the environmental carrier that offers the coverage. Some carriers provide coverage for viruses, other ones don't provide coverage for viruses. But if the waste stream, sewage in this case, contains fecal matter from people that have COVID, thus the COVID bacteria in the stream, and that contaminates an area, it would be the responsibility of the carrier to pay for the cleanup of that sewer spill, no matter what the contaminant biological stew of viruses and other contaminants would be in that. So if it required additional disinfection as part of the cleanup, that would be part of the cleanup costs.
All right. Well, thank you again for taking a few minutes with us this morning. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. And if anybody has any additional questions or seeks information, I'd be glad to answer any and all questions. The last page of the presentation has my contact information. And thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of the seminar.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
Next presenter will be Gary Millward. Gary earned a bachelor's degree in history and a Juris Doctorate from BYU. Gary has also clerked for the 4th District Court of Utah and previously worked as the Deputy District Attorney for Humboldt County in Nevada. Gary has worked the past 10 years as an Assistant City Attorney with Provo City with primary responsibilities in claims management, civil litigation, and criminal prosecution. And Gary will present on the current trends and claims and legal liability impacting the city specifically and public agencies in general. So thank you very much, Gary.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm reminded of a line from a play I was in high school where it says, "Cease these exaltations or I shall blush." Very much I feel that. I appreciate the opportunity to be a presenter. I think like most people, sometimes you have a bit of imposter syndrome. And it makes me feel like maybe I do know what I'm doing with respect to my job when I'm invited to do something like this. So I appreciate that very much. And I appreciate also these risk conferences each time that we have a chance to have them and attend them. And I'm hopeful, I'm sure like the rest of you, that with the end of the pandemic, next time we can perhaps do this in person. I am the type of person that plays to a crowd better than technology. So I'm just going to assume that all of you laugh heartily at all of my jokes and nod sagely at any words of wisdom I may have to share, because I can't tell the difference either way. I'm just looking into a camera. And as we were getting ready for this conference, I made reference at one point to the old Tom Hanks movie, Joe versus the Volcano, where Joe talks about the fluorescent lights sucking the life out of him. I often feel that in our 50-year-old city center that we're fortuitously having replaced right now. But I feel too that I should apologize to all of you. I don't think it's so great on the shiny pate. If that is hurting your eyes, please look away. I put some stock in Shakespeare's line that what time hath scanted man in hair, he hath given him in wit. Whether or not you find that to be true, you can be the judge by the end of this presentation. It may be that I have gained some wit with age. It may be that I am both bald and dumb. You can be the judge yourself. You'll notice too on this first slide, I have in true lawyerly fashion, what kind of lawyer would I be without a disclaimer? A small line at the bottom that says, everything that I'm about to say in this presentation represent my views only. They do not represent the views of either the Provo City Attorney's Office or Provo City. And as you can see here with my next slide, I have to apologize to each of you that I am fairly well versed in PowerPoint. I hope that not too many of you will find it torturous as we go through. I realize often in these type of conferences, there's just so many PowerPoints that at some point you feel like you're going to go cross-eyed. I hope that I don't deluge you in such a fashion that you find that to be the case, and I try to make each of them somewhat interesting. I can only aspire to do as well as Scott and Dave. I really appreciate their presentations. Incidentally, I went to law school with James Burkhart, who was an Ice Cat BYU hockey player for some time. So little crossover there. And of course, many of you who know me better know that I'm a diehard BYU fan. So go Cougs. Moving along. We'll start with just kind of an overview of the things that I'm going to talk about today. Obviously, legal liability in local government, that's a very broad topic. Like some of the other things that we've talked about or have discussed with us this morning, a lot of the parts of legal liability that I'm going to discuss today are things that we could spend a few hours or a day on individually with some of the contours that come through different ideas and concepts and the evolution of case law, the way things are handled through the court system. That's a real detriment to doing a presentation like this because it's almost impossible to give you really nitty-gritty details like you will need. So you'll find throughout my presentation I have a kind of repeated message, which is talk to your lawyer. And for those of you who are lawyers, perhaps you could take this presentation as something you could perhaps share with your clients about why they should be talking to and listening to you in the things that they do. Because obviously, the things we do in our organizations are what lead to lawsuits. When we step on people's toes or give them reason to believe, whether with cause or without cause, that they have been injured, they often come after us. So we're going to talk about federal causes of action. The most common, of course, of those is 1983 civil rights violations. So we'll talk about that. A few words on qualified immunity. Then we will transition into state causes of action. Some of those things that we deal with, along with two, I think, germane subsets of that area of law: governmental immunity and the public duty doctrine. Next, we're going to talk about some cases that I personally have done. For those of you who've been coming to Risk Conference for some time, some of that might be familiar. I'm going to talk about a couple of cases that I talked about some 4 or 5 years ago, the last time I was asked to present. But they are so relevant to the topics that we're going over, and due to my personal involvement in them, I hope you will indulge me with a repeat on a couple of those. And if time allows, we can talk about other recent cases, both in the 10th Circuit Court and before the Utah Appellate Courts, having to do with local liability in court actions that are existing before the court. But of course, how could we start anything like this without a little Lionel Hutz? Yeah, hopefully all of you could hear that. We had a little difficulty with getting the sound to work properly, but in any event, I think most people in the world who are not attorneys can sense that type of feeling from attorneys. And as somebody who practices in the trenches with the plaintiff's bar, I definitely understand the sentiment. Generally speaking, nobody likes being involved in a lawsuit, either on the plaintiff side or the defense side. And it's my experience that it's pretty rare that anybody walks away from a case completely happy with what occurred. I think, I suppose, with the exception if you're playing defense and you have a case completely dismissed, which of course does happen sometimes. Now, like Calvin here, I'm not sure that your average garden variety person in America understands all of their rights, but certainly we have enough people that Section 1983 litigation is one of the biggest things that we have to deal with in local government liability issues. I've tried to keep a minimum to stuffing you full of heavily worded statutes and rules, but this is one that I think, even with my many ellipses, big fan of the ellipses, is important to talk about. So 1983 says every person who, under color of any statute, ordinance, regulation, custom, or usage, subjects any citizen of the United States to the deprivation of any rights, privileges, or immunities secured by the Constitution and laws shall be liable to the party injured in an action at law. So let's talk about some of the most common of those. Obviously, there are a plethora of rights. This is one of the areas where it would take us too long to go through all of them. So I've sort of tried to glean down those that I think are most common for local, municipal, county, and other government subdivisions to deal with. First is religion, speech, and press First Amendment rights. This, I think, is a fairly hot topic with what went on this past summer. This is something that here in Provo we had to deal with pretty routinely throughout the summer. And some of you may have seen in the news, of course, that during one of those incidents we had a shooting in the middle of the day in broad daylight during one of those demonstrations. And we've had to tackle some of those challenges about how do we balance allowing people to exercise those First Amendment rights versus fulfilling our obligation to the citizens to keep people safe. Obviously a very difficult thing to do, particularly with some of the volatility that we have seen throughout the country in the past year. Next, illegal searches and seizures. Those of you who have police departments or sheriff's departments are going to appreciate that this is a big one. Police have just hundreds of thousands of interactions with people every day, most of which, thankfully, and of course the news would not talk about this, but most of which go quite well. But when our police officers do things that either they shouldn't or that citizens think that they shouldn't, we may end up with Fourth Amendment search and seizures claims. Those are pretty prevalent in my experience. Similar to that is self-incrimination. Those of you who are not lawyers and watch any TV, if it's a police or lawyer show of any kind, have heard, of course, you have the right to remain silent. Sometimes, of course, our police may do things that they ought not to do, or something that is fine and plaintiffs' attorneys convince their clients that they ought not to have done. So those are some claims to look out for. Cruel and unusual punishment. Strangely enough, I have actually had a time or two dealing with this, even though Provo City does not have a jail. We take our arrestees directly to the Utah County Jail. And yet, even in the limited time in which we have people in custody, we have seen some of those levied against the city. And of course, anybody who keeps inmates in custody is liable to have Eighth Amendment claims. And of course, the big one, due process. Due process civil rights claims come in a much broader category where really any injury to a person's rights, be it through what we're doing in a government act or seizure of property or takings or things of that nature, fall under this larger umbrella of due process claims under the 14th Amendment. So those are some of the most common ones that we deal with. This, of course, leads us to a broader question of what do we do to prevent federal claims. Obviously, I think it behooves all of us in local government to do what we can on a prophylactic basis to keep our entity from being sued. Now, to succeed on a 1983 claim, a plaintiff has to prove that their constitutional rights were violated, and that the violation was caused by a person acting under what the courts call color of law, which means essentially vested with authority as a government actor. Now, Section 1983, by its own language, it's not a source of substantive rights. You don't sue on the basis of 1983. It's instead a remedial statute that's intended to provide a vehicle for lawsuits for violation of constitutional rights. And so a plaintiff has to start by identifying what particular constitutional right they're alleging has been violated. And they have to show, in addition to that, that their injury was caused by that violation. There's no such thing as vicarious liability when it comes to 1983 claims. And often I've been somewhat surprised in my practice that it's pretty often that you have plaintiffs' attorneys allege that there is such a thing as vicarious liability, and that the city or the county or the district, what have you, will be liable merely by dint of the fact that their employee violated a constitutional right. That is generally speaking not the case. Instead, the plaintiff has to prove that each defendant, individual or entity, individually caused the constitutional injury for which they are complaining. And because that's the case, only intentional conduct is actionable under 1983. It's something that the government employee or the government entity meant to do. Negligence is therefore insufficient to incur liability under Section 1983. So what do we do then to prevent getting these types of claims? I think the first key is to be familiar with civil rights. We've just gone staccato over some that I consider to be the most likely fertile grounds for claims that civil rights have been violated, but there are many. So it I think is wise for government actors in local government to be familiar with civil rights that are out there and ones that we should, in any event, try not to be treading on. I personally tend to have a somewhat Madisonian bent. I named my oldest child James Madison because I'm such an admirer of Madison and his construction under the Constitution, and of course his drafting of the Bill of Rights. Those are things that we ought to be striving for anyway as an aspirational standard. But with respect to protecting the entities that we work for, it behooves us to know what we're talking about. On the same vein, it's critical to consistently and frequently train, especially I would say the frontliners in our organizations that are dealing with citizens, obviously police officers, but I would say really anybody that interacts with the public on a consistent basis should get training about these things. Why being familiar with people's constitutional rights and trying to protect them is important, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because it can help us protect our entities from these type of lawsuits. Next, and very importantly, talk to your lawyer. As I indicated at the outset, this would be a frequent and oft repeated call to action for each of you. It is very difficult at times to manage risk and advice as an attorney when we don't know what is going on. So it's very helpful before things are executed, before things are done, to know about what is happening so we can give advice on the front end to help prevent some of these claims from ever coming to be in the first place. A quick anecdote about that, which hopefully I'm not overstepping to share. I've now, I think as they mentioned, I've been litigating for Provo City now for just under 10 years. And early in my coming back to the city, I had another attorney in my office come in and indicate that we had a piece of equipment that was ordered by the city, and after spending $750,000 on this piece of equipment, it had gotten to a testing stage, and after a significant number of tests, it was not functional. And so we had said to the entity that was doing the fabrication of this device that that's no good. We got to have our money back or a working piece of equipment. And they said, nah, don't think we're going to do that. And so the other attorney came into my office to say, well, you know, it looks like it's headed toward litigation. What do we do? And I said to him, well, bring me the contract and I'll have a look at it. And he said, about that, no contract. So that was a stark lesson for me about the importance of talking to your lawyer before you get into the weeds and you know, do a handshake deal on something that's worth $750,000. Fortuitously, that story ends with a happy ending. They ended up refunding the money to Provo City, and I had to take no action. But I think it's illustrative of the idea that you should definitely talk to your lawyer before. And finally, and we'll see in a few additional slides from here why this is so important. But I'd like to emphasize you should especially talk to your lawyer about policy-making decisions. Before you do anything significant in implementing, instituting, or changing policy, or even reviewing policy, it's pretty critical that you talk to your lawyers so you can get a handle on what you ought or ought not to be doing when you do that. Now, even when we follow all of those steps, it is unavoidable. It is your destiny. There's going to be claims. That is just part and parcel of doing business. Often, when people ask me about what I do in my job, I reference the fact that Provo City is a fairly sizable organization. I'm sure there are those in bigger ones listening and smaller, but we've got about 1,600 employees total, and they're out there every day interacting with people in the public, and it's just inevitable in the nature of risk that things are going to happen, and we're going to have claims. So let's talk for a few minutes about some of that. Now, traditionally speaking, you couldn't really have claims against local government entities themselves. It was limited pre-1984 to only government actors individually, so the police officer or the mayor or what have you. But a case in 1984 through the Supreme Court called Monell opened the door. Monell liability essentially says that there are circumstances in which the local government entity may be held liable, and we'll talk a little bit about the contours of that. First of all, the employer-employee relationship is insufficient. As I mentioned a moment ago, vicarious liability is not a thing. That remained true with this Monell opinion. Just because your employee did something does not mean that the government entity itself is liable for the actions of that employee. However, if there is a policy, custom, or practice that directly leads to the violation of constitutional rights, then the government entity itself may be held liable in that scenario. So a policy, when I use the word policy there in that first list, that means an officially promulgated policy. So you can think in those terms, that's something like the city council passed a resolution, or the county commission has a personnel policy that says X, Y, Z. If you have it written down, official stance of your government entity, and it leads to the violation of somebody's rights, that will give rise to liability under Monell. Next, if it is not official but so widespread as to be custom, which maybe sounds a little bit scary. I find in the case law that this is not as frightening as it may look at first blush. Essentially, the courts require that you have to have some established pattern to consider something to be a custom. There's a case out of the 10th Circuit sometime first part of the last decade where a police officer in Colorado had been accused of rape, and while he was being investigated for that, his purported victim committed suicide, and so his employing agency was unable to determine whether or not he had committed a crime, whether or not he had violated policy. So they ended up demoting him. They put him on the worst shift. They did not fire him. They're trying to strike a balance. And then subsequent to that, he raped a victim of a crime that he was investigating. And of course, she sued. It was a county sheriff's department. She sued the county. She sued the individual officer. 10th Circuit Court of Appeals threw out the case against the county on the basis that there was no evidence that this was customary. They pointed even to the officer's prior discipline as evidence that it was not custom to permit that type of sexual misconduct among their officers. And so essentially what I'm saying is if you have something in a department or division or throughout your organization that is customary and that you have incidents and you don't take action, that can give rise to Monell liability. So just be aware of that. Finally, if it's a policymaker decision, In those instances, so we're talking about something like somebody who sets policy, an elected official, or often a department director, somebody invested with authority to do those things. If they make the decision, then Monell liability can attach since they act as the decision maker for the entity. So as I mentioned a moment ago, taking preventative steps reduces the likelihood of a Monell vulnerable policy customer practice. If you're talking to your attorney about your policy making, hopefully you can insulate yourself to some extent from any of these inevitable claims having teeth against you. And finally, as a plug for all my fellow attorneys out there, when you have done that in advance and you've worked hard to insulate and armor yourself against federal claims, it's going to help your lawyer win some of these unavoidable lawsuits. I've had a few where I was very grateful that I was able to go through Provo City policy and training and use that effectively to kill the lawsuit. Some of you may recall some 10 years ago, Provo City had an incident where a Provo City police officer was accused of pulling over a motorist who was involved in an accident and ultimately committing a sexual battery on her. It turned out through evidence that we gathered during the pendency of that lawsuit that those allegations were entirely true and that he had done it. But I had sufficient evidence through both city policy about harassment and his specific individualized training that we were able to prevail on that case through summary judgment. So that's kind of a very nutshell version of an instance where taking some of these preventative steps and working with your attorneys can help you in the long run. Finally, and probably most painfully, there are no damage caps on federal claims. So if you get tagged, it's kind of an open universe of how hefty the damage can be to you and your organization. This is true, I think, even in those instances where the plaintiff suffered no actual damages and they get $1 nominal recovery. In those instances, often they will also recover their attorney fees, which can run in the hundreds of thousands or millions. So that's something to take into account with your calculus. Next, let's talk for a few minutes about qualified immunity. This has been a hot topic. I've put here in my meme and cartoon, trying to find ones that encapsulate the essence of the opposing points of view. Of course, we have the Batman standpoint, which is qualified immunity is great and it protects police officers from frivolity, and then we have the laughing evil officer who you can't touch me because I've got qualified immunity. So let's talk a little bit about that. The concept of qualified immunity is based in common law, tort immunity, and we'll have further discussion on immunity when we talk about state claims. But it essentially says the state is immune. And as the case law is developed in this area of law, it essentially says that government officials are immune unless they violated clearly established rights a reasonable person would have known about in their situation. And so when the courts have begun to analyze 1983 claims where the government actor responds with a qualified immunity defense, that is the inquiry that they're making. Whether what occurred is something that they violated that a reasonable person ought to have known before they took the action. As I mentioned a moment ago, particularly with all the things that happened throughout the United States this past summer and into the fall, there has been recent disfavor and calls for abandonment of the doctrine. And obviously, you could all deduce where my bread is buttered. I defend police officers professionally, so I guess if we abandon the doctrine of qualified immunity, there is some job security inherent in that idea. But I definitely side more with Batman. And I will confess too, I've been quite troubled by some of the things going around social media that have displayed an almost crippling lack of understanding of the doctrine. I found a lot of people who are calling for the end of qualified immunity simply do not understand it. And so maybe that behooves us in and out of our professional settings to try to educate people. I don't know, maybe a lost cause, I don't know, but that is part of it. Here's a cartoon principally for the lawyers. For the non-lawyers, if you've heard the word torts, maybe you've been in government long enough to know what torts are. Torts you can think of just as personal injury. That is ambulance chasing laws. So let's talk about state claims, where torts are going to fall. State claims are available to injured people both through the common law and, as time has gone on, more and more through statutory constructions, rights of action conferred upon citizens. And really, the common law is kind of a loose and amorphous thing. That is to say that plaintiffs could come up with a new cause of action, insofar as they can get the courts to buy off on it. It could subsequently be recognized as a legitimate state claim. Obviously, things that are enshrined in statutory language are things for which a potential plaintiff could sue. There are all kinds. This is kind of similar to the civil rights rigmarole we went through a few moments ago. I have again tried to just cobble together what I think are the most common, at least in the state of Utah. You have contract disputes, declaratory judgment disputes, employment law claims, grandma. Everybody loves grandma. Grandma claims. We love dealing with grandma. Land use opinions. In going through the past year of appellate opinions in the state of Utah, I think this is probably the most common thing that we get entangled with in the appellate courts. Property, sexual harassment, and of course the big one is torts. Personal injury both seems to be the most common and potentially the most damaging for the things that we do. So let's talk about immunity, historic principles with respect to state claim immunity. Obviously, in legal liability with local government entities, the interplay between state causes of action and immunity is critical. In fact, I think this, in a lot of ways, when we're not in federal court dealing with federal claims, this is the bread and butter, at least of what I do in terms of defending the city from the claims that we deal with. So the bedrock principle is that the king can do no wrong. The idea behind immunity is based in English jurisprudence tradition, which essentially said the king cannot be sued. So here we have Aragorn, son of Arathorn, Elisar the Elfstone, the Dunedain, king of the reunited kingdom of Gondor and Arnor, and of course the heir of Isildur and Elendil, descendant of Elros and Eärendil, the Marinor who had the Silmaril forged by Fëanor the Great. Now, if any of you understood half of what I just said, I salute you. And for those of you who are creasing your brow or scratching your head, please accept my sincerest apologies. I could not resist. I take some comfort in knowing that if I had said this 21 years ago, virtually everybody attending this conference, virtually or in person, would have given me a puzzled look. But thanks to Peter Jackson, at least some of you know what I'm talking about. With that aside, back to immunity, for which the king can do no wrong. Under the common law, under the English common law, this was full immunity. You simply could not sue for any reason, for any cause of action, under any circumstances. And as I mentioned, this was adopted in American jurisprudence really from before the founding of the Republic. Even in the age of the American colonies, these principles were part of American jurisprudence, which was largely borrowed and based on the British system. Now, unfortunately, what we have found is that sovereign immunity has gradually eroded. So no longer do we have Aragorn, son of Arathorn, king of the reunited kingdom. He is simply Aragorn, the Ranger of the North, mud-stained and homeless, houseless, and bereft of lordship. So let's talk about how that has come to be. In 1787, with the United States Constitution, the general principle was accepted that government entities could not be sued because they represented what, under British jurisprudence, was the king. This changed with a Supreme Court case the opinion was issued in 1793. In 1792, this Alexander Chisholm attempted to sue the state of Georgia. to recover payments for goods that he supplied to Georgia during the American Revolutionary War. Georgia just did not appear. They said, you can't sue us. We would have to consent to the suit. The Supreme Court disagreed and abrogated government immunity pretty much in its entirety for a very brief period of time. In response to this, the 11th Amendment was passed, ratified in 1795, which essentially reinstated for state governments the concept of sovereign immunity. The state cannot be sued without consenting to the suit. Now, what matters for us here in this conference is that the 11th Amendment does not extend, however, to political subdivisions of those states. It is only state governments, departments, and agencies that enjoy the sovereignty conferred by that amendment. So local government immunity throughout the United States is governed essentially by the code of the individual states, what they have to say about it and how they have constructed it. In Utah, this was codified in Utah Code 63G7, which is, of course, the Governmental Immunity Act of Utah. We have found, sadly, that as years have gone by, immunity, and this is true also in Utah, where we still enjoy somewhat robust immunity, immunity is getting whittled away. It doesn't really expand, it just declines. And that is true both through the case law and through the legislature fiddling with what's in the statute. So I think that's something we just all have to be aware of. And maybe if we have time, I might return to that. We'll talk a little bit about some of those issues. So let's talk about immunity contours. I think I'll go through this relatively quickly. Obviously, one of the reasons we have immunity is Calvin's attitude in this cartoon. We have too many potential plaintiffs out there who maybe were not truly injured, but want to know who they can sue so they can get some money. That is a recurrent problem that we see. In the early going of immunity jurisprudence in the United States, you saw these distinctions between governmental function, proprietary functions. Was the government acting as a government actor? Was it doing something like a business? Over the years, this became modified to, are they doing a discretionary act, something they could make a policy decision over, or was it a ministerial act where they're just administering the policy decisions already made? In our day and time, and particularly in Utah, these labels are pretty much ignored. The immunity statute now says explicitly, no matter how labeled, the Immunity Act applies to all government activities, no matter how labeled. So those distinctions have been eschewed. So really what we come down to is a question of what is in the statute and what does it mean? And sometimes that might be a little bit more difficult than you would guess. I think last time I presented, I discussed this at least briefly. For example, we have in the immunity statute the natural condition on the land exemption, which essentially says that government entities are immune for injuries that arise from natural conditions on the land. Well, that seems pretty straightforward, but we found as we've gone forward that there are a heck of a lot of things that under Utah Supreme Court case law are not natural conditions on the land, such as wind. That's an atmospheric condition that blows over the land, or a bear. A bear is a transitory condition that walks over the land. It's not on the land. Or a man-made reservoir is not a natural condition because it wasn't put there by nature, it was put there by man. Pretty much this has left us with topography. We've got rocks and elevation, maybe running water, and that's about it. I mean, the jurisprudence has essentially gutted it. But still, for us, we have to go and look at the statute and see what it says, see what it prohibits and what it doesn't. And of course, we've all dealt with these things where we think, boy, we should be suing them. I've got a case running right now where it's kind of a ridiculous lawsuit where the plaintiff rear-ended our vehicle and we're getting sued. But there you have it. You get all kinds. Now, what our Governmental Immunity Act does, it delineates those areas of immunity for which immunity is retained. It shows us where immunity is not retained and has been waived, essentially where plaintiffs or potential plaintiffs can go ahead and sue us. It sets forth the claim requirements that such plaintiffs are required to undergo. Just touching on a couple of the more relevant ones and ones for which government entities often get out of these type of lawsuits. Claims got to be filed within 1 year of the date of the event that gave rise to the claim. There is now a 2-year total statute of limitations. It's a fairly recent change, and one that, for my purposes of defense, I do not love. But they now have 2 years total, regardless of when their claim is denied, and that's yet another example of the diminution of protection that we have under government immunity as time goes by. Unfortunately, there are damage caps. I should say, fortunately, unlike federal claims, there are damage caps for state law claims. Current rates are $745,200 for individual and $3 million aggregate per occurrence. Those, of course, change each year. And let me just make one other note about this before we move on to other topics. I've had a number of people remark to me that, if the courts are so hostile to immunity, why do we put it up in court? Why do we try to fight this? And my response to that, and maybe some of you would not or do not agree with, is that there's no point in having immunity if we're not going to make use of it. If the court is going to whittle it down, they're going to whittle it down. But for us to not make use of it while it exists sort of defeats the purpose of having it. And so I personally am very much in favor of using these shields as much as we can. We'll see as we talk about some of the Provo cases that maybe I'm wrong-headed in that thinking, given what they do sometimes. But in any event, let's talk for a few more minutes about the public duty doctrine. This is a common law principle where essentially it says government can't be liable when the breach of a duty is of a duty owed to the general public instead of to a particular individual. This doctrine is now actually codified in Utah in the Immunity Act 63G72025. But, and I think this is another area where many people would not necessarily agree with me on. It is my opinion that this is nearly a dead letter due to what the courts have done with what they call the special relationship doctrine in the public duty doctrine. I could be jaded from my own experience, which we'll talk about in a minute. But let me give you some examples. A dance instructor speaking to a dancer has a special relationship under Utah jurisprudence. A park ranger waving at campers on their way down from a campsite has a special relationship with those campers. Anyone engaged in a high-speed pursuit has a special relationship with any potential person that might be injured by that high-speed pursuit. Someone who owns a home close to a particular water line has a special relationship with the government entity that owns that water line, even if they've never ever talked to anyone in the government entity ever. Hospital or prison escapees have a special relationship with anybody that they may come in contact with. Anyway, the point is, I'm being mildly facetious, but not too much. It's pretty ridiculous. And finally, there is now a Utah case that says any affirmative act by a government actor creates a special relationship. So the public duty doctrine can only apply to omissions. So this is one that I think has pretty much been gutted. There may be an occasional case where some omission happened to a general member of the public where there is no duty to a particular individual, but it's going to be pretty limited. My time is rapidly running out, but I'm gonna go rapid fire through some of our cases that have bearing on these issues. And some of you may remember the two cases I'm going to talk about. So for that, I apologize. Bear with me. Hopefully they're moderately interesting. This case, I'm a little bit limited on what I can say because it's an ongoing case. The plaintiff's wife committed suicide in June of 2009. So we were entering year 12 of litigation on this case, and it just keeps going and going and going. So there's little I can say about the facts, but I will say what I can. There is a dispute of fact in this case. The bottom line of it is that police officers were summoned by husband. He intimated to them that his wife was suicidal. She said otherwise to the police, and in fact said that he was just trying to get her out of the house so he could have his girlfriend over. The police ultimately separated them, told the husband that he should call the police back if there's any further issues and left. She went into her room, went to sleep, and then sometime later ground up pills and committed suicide. He has filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the city, which we've now been defending for some time. Years ago, we got a dismissal on this case through the public duty doctrine. The Utah Court of Appeals then reversed that, indicating that we have a special relationship with this woman through her very brief interaction with the police. The opinion kind of chaps my hide. While I appreciate that the court has to accept the non-moving party's version of the facts, the court, in their opinion, say repeatedly that we tucked her into bed, which is not really what happened. But in any event, that's something in the coming trial that we will duke out when we eventually get to that point. During oral arguments, we thought things were going well. One of the judges said, "Isn't this a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation for the police? They can either arrest someone against their will with no crime being committed, or they can leave and have this happen." We really thought that was a good indicator for us, but the opinion came down otherwise. Further on down the line, and this is why we have no fear, the grammar police is here. I discovered a defect in the filing of this case and made a motion to dismiss because the plaintiff had the wrong party, the estate, instead of an heir or a personal representative. And the district court threw the case out on that basis. Court of Appeals overturned us. Supreme Court affirmed that on opposite grounds. So eventually we had to deal with that case. So, next, we have Craig v. Provo City. Those of you who are attorneys may have seen this in the Supreme Court opinion that came down on it. I'm going to have to go super staccato because my time is short. In this case, we had an issue where Ms. Craig and a business associate and business they had created were receiving items that Nu Skin had produced and that Nu Skin told the police detectives were stolen from them. Ultimately, the district court did not bind over their criminal cases, and they went ahead and sued the city for our involvement on that. I had this case dismissed for failure to file a bond in state court, and then they filed in federal court. I had that one dismissed for failure to state a cause of action. They were given leave by the court to try again. They did. It was dismissed again on the same basis, and then they filed a new state claim, this time outside of the statute of limitations. And so on that basis, I made a motion to dismiss. District court agreed. Court of Appeals overturned that. We took it up to the Supreme Court. And finally, after many years of litigating, the case was over. Last laugh, though, was for the plaintiff, because then the legislature changed the statute. And this is kind of what I'm talking about with immunity eroding. They changed the statute to add in a saving statute to prevent what happened in this case happening in the future. But as I said, if I don't make use of it now, we make use of it never. It's like it's not there. I have often called it the zombie case. We'll have to skip that. I've had a list of recent cases that I will not go through due to time constraints, but feel free to look these up when you get my slides. Bottom line to my presentation, you should always consult your attorney. You should consider taking your attorney's advice. I'll just leave it at that. Follow sound risk management principles in the things that you do. Train your people, I'll reemphasize that. And use a sensible insurance structure. Our kind hosts of these conferences can help you out with that. I think it's simple wisdom to have things in place that are going to protect you should things go south in a lawsuit. You'll see the chicken. My first boss out of law school, after I clerked, told me that often you're going to have to make chicken feathers into chicken soup. And often I find it's even more like a rubber chicken into chicken soup. The attorneys don't make the facts, and we don't make the law. We just try to do the best we can with the situations that arise with our entities. And so I think it's really critical to have an insurance structure that's going to protect you in case things go south. And finally, we will have one more Lionel Hutz as we bid farewell. There's attorneys for you. Thank you all for your attention. I appreciate it very much. And if there's time, I will take questions. I used a little more than I ought to.
Thanks so much, Gary. As somebody who consumed way too much Simpsons as a child. Both those clips are near and dear to my heart. They're occupying way too much brain real estate. Lionel Hutz is just the best, worst attorney out there. Couple of questions that came in. Do you know of any significant federal or state law cases that could change the nature of legal liability of local government?
I don't think that there have been any massive changes recently with respect to the case law. The ones that I listed are opinions decided in the last year in the 10th Circuit, and those ones I think are ones that came out sort of how the local government entity would like, with one exception. And so pretty much following the rules that we've been accustomed to for quite some time. I think the graver threat is the social movement to modify how these cases are done, because I think that's gaining more and more traction with, unfortunately, a populace that doesn't really understand what we're dealing with. Because those of us who handle these cases routinely know that the actual case with teeth is rare, and when we get them, we typically settle them. So the ones from which case law are made are not those cases.
Okay, I've got another one in here that says, do you have an outside investigator you can recommend to do an independent investigation regarding a complaint against a police department?
Oh, that is an excellent question. For my claims purposes, I have in-house claims investigators, but I have used such a person, and his name is jumping right out of my head. I'm not sure that he still does it because he's accepted a job as chief of police somewhere in northern Utah. Can't think of his. I will have to get back to you on his name. There's an aging process for you, but I've had him a few times do some things like that for our police department. We had, this is years ago, but 10 years ago or so, we had Citygate Associates do such a review of our police department. That was a consequence of the case I made reference to with the sexual battery. And we followed some of the recommendations of that. It's Ken Wallentine is the person I'm thinking of. Ken Wallentine, who's really great. I don't know that he still does those kinds of things, but you may look into that. We've been quite pleased with his work when he was doing consulting. At Citygate, I'm not sure that's still a going concern. It's been about a decade, but those are the two that I'm familiar with.
Yeah, I think Ken's actually on the conference, so shout out to Ken. You've just got a ring endorsement.
I know we've done a few things together over the years, so.
Let's see, one other question. Any particular type of claims that you're especially concerned with? It's kind of a broad question.
I think the big ones for us have, at least in recent years, all of you I'm sure saw in the news what we went through with our last police chief. That was a sexual harassment issue. I think again with some of the things that are happening in society at large, with the Me Too movement, we're seeing, and I think probably a good thing, victims. I also do criminal prosecutions. I think it's good for victims to come forward when they're victimized. But I think we've definitely seen an uptick in that kind of case. And so I would urge everybody to address those issues with proactive sexual harassment training. So in those 1983 lawsuits, you can avoid the Monell aspect of it. Your employees got to know that kind of stuff is not acceptable, and that if they engage in it, they're going to be on their own with respect to the lawsuit.
Okay, and one more. Can you explain the difference between the 1 year to file a claim and the 2-year statute of limitations in Utah?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So in order to sue a state or local government entity in the state of Utah, a notice of claim has to be filed with the government entity, and that notice still has to be filed within a year of the date that the claim accrued, or else they lose their right to sue. However, under the old structure, after you had your claim denied, you had 1 year from the date of denial to sue the government entity. That aspect has now changed, where if somebody was hurt on today, let's say today's date, March 23rd, and they filed their notice of claim on the 24th, and I denied on the 25th, they still have 2 total years to file their complaint. But before they can file a complaint, they must file a claim within a year to give the government entity an option to settle the claim. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So thank you again, Gary, for taking the time with us this morning. I really enjoyed your presentation.
It's my pleasure to introduce our last presenter today, which is Tom Rickard. Tom Rickard has a distinguished insurance career as a lead manager and production supervisor for over 20 years in the insurance industry. He currently works for Allied Public Risk with responsibility for production and as an emerging risk specialist. Tom has extensive underwriting experience that spans many different unique perspectives on emerging risk that impact local government. Tom has a number of professional designations, including the CPCU, ARM, ARME, ARMP, ARC, and ARE. Tom attended Trinity University and earned BA degrees in philosophy and history. He currently resides in Dallas, the Dallas, Texas area. His topic today is risk managers' greatest concerns as we get past COVID-19. And with that, we'll turn the time over to Tom.
Thanks, Darrell. I appreciate it, and I appreciate everybody virtually joining today. Again, like everyone else, I've missed being at some of the conferences and seeing people. I want to, a lot of what I do and how I approach risk management in the public entities that I serve has always been data driven. And we're going to see right now, based upon where we are in the pandemic, that there is not a lot of real data to use. What I'm going to do is sort of touch on some of the things that we are learning anecdotally, some of the surveys that have been done by different organizations that work with our cities, towns, and other public entities around the country, and then try and give some insights based upon the 30 years that I've worked with local governments in the risk management and insurance sector. So, really what we have to understand, and I think everyone who's in this conference has had it touch them somewhat, is that local governments have been the first line of response during the pandemic, based on services that had to continue and be provided. Police still had to answer calls. Community hospitals had to be available for the influx of people who were affected by the virus. We still had ongoing during the pandemic. We had the social eruptions that we had after certain incidences that we saw in the news, so that public safety was still a forefront of everyone's mind, and also the public welfare, getting people, whether it was mask mandates, lockdowns. We've gone through a lot, but all of these things that we've gone through, that local governments, cities, counties, water districts, parks and rec, they've been at the forefront. Emergency responders have been at the forefront of having to deal with this crisis. There have been several surveys that have sort of reached out to public entity risk managers and local leaders to try and understand some of the things that they've experienced during the pandemic. 75% of the respondents didn't think about pandemic as a key risk. However, one of the things about that was that through the discussions with local leaders and looking at the policies and procedures that they did have in place, was that as a group, the public sector was more prepared and were more likely to have a pandemic plan because of things that were set up during the SARS scare in 2003. Now, One of the weaknesses was many of those plans had not been updated or tabletop exercised, but they were there and they at least gave an outline of some of the things that needed to be done. One of the things that's also been discovered is that the public sector right now through these surveys, and this was a global survey that Aon did, was the only industry or risk group that ranked another health crisis at the top of the list of future incidences. Most risk managers felt that their response was sufficient, but again, felt that some more planning would have helped. They also, most feel that they're in that recovery phase. When you look at the phases of mitigation, of how do we keep our losses to a minimum, how we respond in the middle of it, the preparedness, the preparation that we had done prior to it. Most feel that they're in that last phase of recovery, of putting together the solutions to for going forward based upon what has already occurred. Most entities, and I think this is telling, anticipate that the impact is going to last more than a year. So we're well past 30, 60 days past that 1 year mark of being involved in the pandemic, and the majority of respondents, this was in the Association of Federal Enterprise Risk Management, felt that the ongoing issues that we're going to face will be for at least another year. So, one of the things, what's changed for risk managers? Really, one of the things I want to emphasize is that the basic model hasn't changed, and these are two illustrations from the ISO 31000 risk management guidelines or framework. The things that we do within risk management, that knowing that that risk management principles, which we don't show here, haven't changed. You still have to line out what it is that you're trying to accomplish. In the framework, at the center is culture and leadership, establishing a risk culture within your organization with your staff. Everyone identifying as a risk manager, that it's everybody's safety is everybody's business, that we're still doing risk assessments, risk response. We have to look at once we do these things, that we continue in the cycle of identification, and then even more granular into the framework of risk identification, analysis, evaluation, how we treat risk, what we do, all those things. That really hasn't changed. So that framework that is established, whether people use the COSO model or the ISO 31000 model, those basics haven't changed. For communities, for public entities, there's a feeling that the ISO 31000 may be a better framework, because it really does consider that risk evaluation and the ability of recovery and resiliency versus ultimate financial impact that COSO looks at in the COSO cube. So that's why I used this illustration. But that model really hasn't changed. So really, it's what did change is that we saw things within this that brought us to understand, for example, in safety, that there was an anxiety prepared with, okay, our plan we may have had a pandemic plan, but how did that integrate or understand that we may have several things going on at once? And we saw that last summer when we had a social upheaval in several cities. We had hurricanes affecting several parts of the United States, the Gulf and Atlantic coasts. We had wildfires. We had other major coinciding events. And how do you manage your pandemic concerns along with these other safety concerns? And that, again, takes us beyond just is this only a COVID thing, or is it something that we need to begin to understand within our risk management plans that we need to be better at understanding that none of these, a lot of our emergencies don't happen in a vacuum and don't happen one at a time. We learned to be better communicators, that people need clear, concise information about what to do, how to, is this office open? If it's not open, how do I get this service? Are we going to continue with our parks program? All these things about how we communicate with the public and our staff, the business community, all became very apparent that as we look at our assessments, that we can't just look at individual pieces, but we have to look at large, we have to look at more granular issues like communication, looking at supply chain, that a lot of issue for emergency responders, it was personal protection equipment, things that were basic to protecting both staff and our citizens. One of the things, I mean, but it's those important things, but it was, if you remember, it was the mundane things too, like toilet paper. I mean, it was understanding that the supply chain can be affected, that we can't look at the immediate loss of an office building. We have to look at what does that mean. As we looked at the supply chain, we look at service continuity, we look at workplace access and changes in how people engage with the community. There was in the demand surge, we had emergency responders. In some cities were overwhelmed by answering calls to people who were having respiratory failure and trying to get them to the hospitals, and then getting to the hospitals and finding the emergency rooms were overwhelmed. So what COVID did was, again, you see all these different areas of safety, supply chain, continuity, all these things were joined together. And sometimes our risk management plans looked at these things in isolation. We understood that if there is a major event, that there could be some disruption in our supply chain. How did we think about that in the supply chain of, now we can't go to the office, therefore people have to work from home. People working from home are going to need laptops. Can we get laptops? So there was all these things that tied together that brought a new awareness to the risk management process. And so while the model remained the same, one of the basic things that I think that communities, risk managers are doing now is looking into that portion of the risk framework where they look at assessments, and that those assessments had always been, what is it out there that could go wrong? What am I doing to minimize some of the impacts? So what's my response? But also now looking at not only what do I need to do to prepare or react in my response, what do I also need to do? How do I prioritize what's going to be the most important thing? And that's that recovery phase. So trying to find now better ways of using the historical data that we have, that we've gotten from our losses or from our experiences, and then also predictive data. What can we now do to say, if this happens, we can now predict that these future things will happen based upon either number of incidences, where we saw breakdowns in the past. So this is that re-engineering of the preparedness, action, and prioritization of risk assessment. So being really keenly aware of, let's go back and look at our risk management plans and the risk analysis that we've done, where we've identified risks and we've assessed what their impact may be. Let's go now look at it through this lens of these cascading events that may occur and these things that may occur across our platform if multiple emergencies exist. And one of the things referred to as the fat tail. When you look at long tail events, if an event falls outside of the distribution in actuarial science and predictive modeling, it's a fat. They call it a fat tail. It's something that, while it may have an inordinate effect, it may be something that may not occur very often, or is predicted to include, maybe one of those 1 in 10,000. The question is, what's the impact of that? So it's to not minimize it because it is the probability is low, but looking at it as what's the possibility plus the impact of it, and how do we deal with that? So, knowing, understanding that that risk model is the same, that risk assessments and a retooling of risk assessments might be necessary based upon what we've learned from the crisis. What is keeping risk managers awake? And what I've looked at several studies that have been done, surveys that have been done over the last 12 months, and sort of gleaned a few things from them. The major issues are the same. I think another health crisis, the economic disruption that's caused by that. But while all these things may be somewhat connected, for example, the social disruption. Social disruption is a concern not just because of some of the things that have occurred because of the pandemic, but as Gary mentioned, there are things relating to law enforcement, to the Me Too movement. Social disruption, also school closures, interaction in neighborhoods with neighbors. All these things have happened that are part of the COVID pandemic, but also there's a broader field that they're occurring in. Climate change, whether it be increased number of storms, intensity of storms, wildfire, droughts, it's a major concern because for communities. One of the things, however, is that with regards to certain mitigation steps, preparedness, there are things that communities can do, but it is dealing with climate change from a local community level is more difficult. There are things that we can do within our cities that can affect it, but it's a much bigger problem that steps that a local government can take are additive but not multiplicative, and can't have the long-term effect that we need to focus on in what we can change within our communities. Also a major cyber event, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, and some of the things that we're mentioning here are going to be explicitly and specifically talked about by other presenters later on some of the emergency trends in cyber and employment practices and workers' compensation. So, part and parcel to all of what these concerns of risk manager are, what has happened during COVID to affect the financial health of our communities. There were many dire predictions back in March and April of last year, especially as people began to try and plan their budgets. Many communities are on a 6/30 fiscal year, and we're just completing their budget work for presentation, and then all these unknowns were there. And where would unemployment go? Where would property taxes go? All these different things. What we do know is that 90%, and this is from a National League of Cities survey that was done in November, is that 90% of communities saw a decrease in revenues, and the average decrease was 21%, and 76% of them saw an increase in expenditures. Those expenditures, whether it was overtime, personal protective equipment, sanitizing buildings, closing down and maintaining buildings, which can be more expensive than maintaining a building that's occupied. So there were all those things went to, in your own households, when your revenues decrease and your expenditures go up, that there's some choices that you have to make. But with the community, there's certain things that you must do. Police must stay on the street. Ambulances have to answer the calls. Firefighters have to respond. The water has to flow and the electricity has to stay on. So those types of things have stressed cities. We've seen many had to have layoffs, wage freezes, furloughs. Even I saw my daughter works for a Parks and Recs with the YMCA, and they furloughed most of their staff for 6 weeks. When they brought people back, they reduced staff, and we're seeing that across our communities. How communities were impacted, again, there's not a lot of real data out there, and some of it is counterintuitive. What I'm showing here is part of a study done by the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings. It looked at, okay, what type of industries are present in a community, and how they will be affected. What's the tax structure? Are they highly reliant on sales tax or property taxes? Those types of how those would be affected. Now, with the lockdowns, there was a feeling that there was going to be a significant impact on sales tax revenue. And there has been, especially in those towns that were focused on hospitality or tourism, where hotel motel taxes and those types of things may have also contributed to the sales tax structure. But other communities have actually seen an increase in sales tax revenue, whether it's big box stores, because people during the lockdowns, a lot of people started doing home projects, whether it's where they do it, tax online sales, which increased significantly. So there's some mixed messages about the ultimate impact, but what we do know is that that revenues from certain sources in highly impacted industries, mining, oil and gas, transportation, leisure, and hospitality, are affecting some communities significantly. I pulled out a couple of Western cities in Colorado and Utah that sort of gives you an idea of, for example, where you have Denver, 52% of the general revenues come from elastic sources like sales tax, and where a lot of the employment is in the high-risk industries, that they would have a more immediate physical impact versus a place like Utah, where although they have a moderate from elastic sources, they have a lower share of employment in high risk, so they would see more effect in the midterm. These studies are going to be ongoing, and there's going to be a significant look back, I think, in 2022 over what the ultimate impact was based on some of these things. But every community's financial picture has been affected, and it's going to impact services that are out there, and infrastructure and maintenance, and those things that are important to keeping a community safe. I'm going to jump into a couple of insurance-related areas. Workers' compensation is one of the areas where we have anticipating some impact, and it's a long-term impact. We know that overall, workers' compensation claims were down in 2020. Because many people were not at work, whether it was construction industry, hospitality industry shut down, those types of things, that those overall claims trended down. However, as maybe expected in some key areas like healthcare and first responders, those claims were trending up. Also in states where where COVID became a presumption. In Utah, they had a buttable presumption that goes through 6/1/2021. We're seeing that those claims are coming again primarily from first responders and healthcare workers. One of the things that is going to make a prediction of the long-term effects are the long-term effects. It's going to make the rates prediction for rates and structure in the future a little bit more difficult, is because we've got studies out there that show that 88% of the people who tested positive for COVID were coping with some form of cognitive dysfunction. This was a study of 4,000 people done by the NIH. Also, a study by Sedgwick Safety National, and also saw that about about 47,000 patients overall, 58% had fatigue, 44% still had headaches. So there's these ongoing effects. So what may occur is that some of the claims that people who've had COVID or tested positive may now begin to experience some of these long-term effects, and that may again change the long-term picture of both total amount of claims paid and the number of claims that we see. There's also the ancillary effects of both stress, of people worried about going to work, worried about traveling, all the things that go along that may, for a firefighter or a police officer, where there's presumption on heart attacks, that again could have downstream effect because of issues that are not specifically because of a COVID infection, but because of all the stress that's related with working in that environment. Also, some of the more mundane things like work from home ergonomics, and seeing upticks in frequency of smaller, not lost time, but more medical claims for carpal tunnel, et cetera, that may come from the work from home ergonomics. So those are some of the things that we may see in workers' compensation, where again, overall claims have trended down. I think they're starting to level off, and we won't see any decrease in the number of claims as the economy again reopens, but we may see lingering effects from those who may have been affected and where there's a presumption. Employment practices, interesting that we did see fewer cases in 2020 EEOC claims, but the makeup of claims has remained somewhat the same as in previous years. Retaliation still being a significant claim, disability discrimination, also failure to accommodate. One of the questions that's I think going to be arising is, because so many people now have done the work from home, does that become a reasonable accommodation in the future? We don't know that. So far, the cases that have come forward are showing that that just because you had to or did during the pandemic, it doesn't mean that it becomes a permanent reasonable accommodation for someone with a disability. But we imagine we will see suits that will arise because of that. There have been claims interference with leave under federal under the FMLA, also under the FFCRA. Most of this, the Family First Corona Response Act did those subsections expired in December of 2020 and made voluntary through the 1st of March of this year. However, what we may see is claims that are in the pipeline, or that people are trying, will now file for back in December. They took 2 weeks leave and feel that they should have received benefits under the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. We may see some of those begin to bubble up over the next several months. Public entity COVID claims with regards to EEOC, and this has primarily been failure to accommodate and interference under the FMLA. Healthcare and first responders, that we did see those, they were outpacing their relative percentage of the workforce in the types of claims that have been presented to the EEOC. So, overall in 2020 compared to 2019, charges were down. However, recoveries were up significantly. The EEOC recovered a record amount of $535 million in 2020 compared to $486 million in 2019. One of the things that should be a little bit concerning is that while those settlements, those that were claims that were settled or mitigated prior to litigation, that the recoveries there were actually a little bit down, but there was significant increase in litigation recoveries, 39 million in 2019 to 106 million in 2020. So for those areas in EEOC where we see combined charges of discrimination and then retaliation, those suits are being litigated and the recoveries are significantly higher than in prior years. One of the interesting things, although on a percentage basis, very few of the claims, but the ones for genomic information, non-discrimination, we've seen an increase, a twofold increase in those in 2020. Could be interesting as we go forward. Could the medical records of somebody having COVID and the anticipated lingering effects, if any of those, that medical history is used in employment decisions, could that bring an increase in those types of claims? It's one of the things to look out for, and maybe one of the HR challenges that Ken Ashworth talks about tomorrow. Just wanted one of the things is that although a lot of public administrative workers have gone back to the respective offices in a lot of states, work from home is now I think more of a reality, and although I think the business community will feel it a little bit more over an extended period of time and on a more permanent level, that there's still going to be those times where work from home becomes necessary. As I mentioned earlier, one of the chief concerns of HR managers is, could there be a next one down the road, and how do we react to it, and have to go back either to lockdowns or a next wave of work from home. Very important that that workforce is managed well, and it really is. Again, we talked again about safety and communications. So it's making sure that that employees are given information about both COVID, for example, as we get towards more vaccines, or things that may be required to come back to work and continue in the workforce. How are those things going to be handled, and just making sure that people are aware of timelines and what things are going to be required. Also, making sure that that policies that may have been looser in the past with regards to remote working, that they really are, that become explicit as to not just the ergonomics and hours at work and the tools that'll be used, remote tools that'll be used, but also making sure that there's a clear line of support for the employees for both their mental health and for their family obligations. I think one of the things that we've learned is that we assume a lot of things about how people work from home, but we need to set clear expectations and find ways to have policies that support the people, but also make sure that they're acting and behaving safely and responsibly during their work time that can mitigate any potential claims. Sort of mundane, and I'm going to talk in a few seconds about some of the blocking and tackling issues, things that we really have to pay attention to because they are the things that drive claims and lost dollars. Open meetings aren't one of those things. We've seen an uptick in individual claims. They normally don't they normally don't cost a lot either to defend or to settle. There are exceptions, but normally it's an injunctive. It's a hey, stop doing this, start doing this, etc. But we know that it isn't. That our concerns aren't just with those things that create claims. They're things that make sure that the reputation and the trust in the community is on a good foundation. And access to the meetings, community involvement, I think is one of the keystones to that. And through this pandemic, cities and towns have had to deal with how do we make sure that citizens' voices are heard, that things that we do are meet the statutory requirements, the sunshine laws and open meetings, and still stay safe and make sure that we're doing things the way that we need to when we were in lockdown mode. Some of these things we want to make sure that they that they go forward. We found that we can have effective meetings with good planning remotely. Making sure that we provide that access, how we do it, and that we make sure that the community remains involved. Which, again, we talked about some of the social concerns. Citizens are becoming more involved and want to have a voice in how the police force is organized, policies and procedures, new walking paths, all the things that go to being part of community are accomplished in our meetings, and we need to make sure that even when we're restricted on meeting together or in numbers, that we find ways to make it easy for our citizens to participate. In the resources section, you'll see that that I've linked Salt Lake City's best practices. I think they've done a really good job on how to best conduct open meetings and citizen meetings during times of crisis. Also, note that we can, that these things aren't just going to be related to pandemics. There will be times when there are other emergencies, whether they're earthquakes, floods, etc., where meeting together it may not work. Now, it may not be over an extended period of time like we've had with COVID. It may be for a month or 2 months as we go through a recovery phase, but the same principles will apply and should be applied to our meetings. Law enforcement claims, I get a lot of questions about, are we seeing more law enforcement claims? Are they, what's going on based upon all of the social issues that have been forefront in the news for not just the last year, but for several years now? I think this is an illustration of word of caution here. This deals with the largest departments in the U.S., but I think it's indicative in that those largest police departments have paid over $3 billion in the last 10 years for alleged civil rights violations. Note that $2.5 billion of that is in the 3 largest cities: New York City, Chicago, and Los Angeles. However, as was mentioned by Gil in the previous presentation, is the Section 1983 in the last 25 years, there's been almost a doubling of the number of claims. Now, again, I'm having to do this somewhat anecdotally based upon what I've seen in public entity claims over the last, and I'm focused on the last 10 years, 5 years, and 3 years, is that over the last 10 years, I've seen an increase in number of claims. Where in the last 3 years, I think that it's not that we're seeing more claims. I think what we're seeing is more is higher verdicts and more claims that cost that are costing dollars to either litigate or settle. So I think there is an awareness that is in our communities that of speaking up when they feel that there have been these violations. Now, with regards to specifically COVID, there was an uptick in the third and fourth quarter in jail claims for failure to provide medical care and some other issues that on the county level. We haven't seen that as much on the municipal level. So I think overall, this heightened awareness goes back not just to seeing increased claims or spending increased dollars to litigate or settle claims. It is that reputational trust issue within our communities for our leaders doing everything they can to protect all of our citizens, and doing it in a way that pays attention and pays respect to the individual rights, to an individual's rights. I think the answer to that is, or I think what I'm seeing from law enforcement claims is that, again, I don't think that we're seeing that things are worse with regards to the number of claims. I think what we will see is that because some of that trust is broken down, that the claims are being inflated. So those are some of the top issues, in workers' compensation, EPLI, and law enforcement, where I've seen people asking questions about claims and what types of claims we're seeing, and has COVID driven an increase or a decrease or a change in the claims picture. Some of the things that don't change is our infrastructure, but how we deal with them. It draws attention to them. During COVID, especially during the lockdown, we see a lot more people out walking, trying to get away from the claustrophobia of being in the house by getting out to a park or do it. So we've seen a higher use of some of that traditional infrastructure. We also saw decreased use in the early part of the lockdowns of our streets and roads, and therefore many infrastructure projects could be engaged. You could gauge in those projects a little bit more safely. However, one of the things that we want to remember about our infrastructure, and this is regardless of pandemics, regardless of those types of emergencies, is that traditional infrastructure are second, losses emanating from those are second only to the auto line of business in frequency and severity. So our streets and roads, whether it's pedestrian fatalities or injuries, negligent design claims, in wastewater, we've seen things that because of aging infrastructure, sewer backup claims, water line breaks, etc. What we found, what this has given us a chance to do is to look at, are there things that we've learned during the pandemic that could help us in dealing with some of our traditional infrastructure challenges. I think we're at that point where some of the things that leakage, for example, leakage detection and control, some of the science that we used in that and the pollution detection we used in identifying COVID hotspots by testing wastewater. Some of the things that we've seen in predictive maintenance, as we looked at, as some of these, we were trying to find out which areas we were going to use for these studies. It helped say, hey, some of these areas that we're looking at were ones that now we can gather data from and use it in predicting, is this the place where we need to do the repairs next? So there was a lot of attention paid to how traditional infrastructure is handled, and how we can pay attention to using new technology to influence future claims and loss outcomes. So from traditional infrastructure, we also have our, the new infrastructure of our IT infrastructure. A lot of attention paid during COVID, because we had people working from home, because of some of the increased hazards that we saw from people using non-secure connections, et cetera. We have to make sure that IT is included in when we think of our traditional infrastructure, that we also think of our IT infrastructure as part and parcel of that. And not every community is going to be able to create a crisis command center for their IT infrastructure. But every single one can provide clear guidelines and training on what apps to use. They can provide the remote tools for people working from home. So it's making sure that in our IT infrastructure, we've dedicated a lot of money to protecting our physical plants, and from a security standpoint, we have to do the same thing on protecting our IT infrastructure. The recent news article about the water district in Florida that experienced a hack gives us clear warning that those that our infrastructure needs to be protected, and that comes from some of the basics of updating vulnerable known security flaws within software and operating systems, of making sure people are trained, which is the biggest bang for your buck, is training employees on password protection, on making sure that they're using, that they're not going to unsecured websites, to making sure our own websites are secure. I'm still surprised by the number of community websites I go to where you go to the front page, and now on Google you'll see hey, this is not a secure website, it's an HTTP versus an HTTPS site. So they don't have an SSL certificate that helps secure that website. Now, a lot of communities may feel that, well, I don't really need it, I'm not taking payments on my website. A lot of them have links, though, to those collection websites where bad actors will then camp out on an insecure website, and then when somebody comes in, they'll follow that trail to the more to the website that collects payments or critical personal information. So making sure that the IT infrastructure is as secure as we've made our physical plants, that we have to make our virtual physical plants as secure, I think is an imperative, and something that I don't think we learned during COVID, but I think was driven home during the COVID because of the number of people who had to be deployed remotely. Last year, ransom attacks in 2020, government organizations were top target. Most of them came from spam and phishing emails. And you can see that I talked about cyber training and security and weak passwords. Those, again, the biggest bang for your buck is to train people, recognize when an email may not be legitimate, when things like transfers of funds occur, picking up a phone, confirming certain things when somebody wants to change bank accounts, et cetera. Those types of human interactions can greatly enhance your cyber security. Average downtime and from ransomware, again, you can see a steady increase. One of the things that we also, an insurance question that's going to be starting to come to the forefront is the OFAC guidance on ransomware payments that was delivered in October of 2020. If an insurance company or an insured facilitates the transfer of funds to someone on an OFAC watch list or to a criminal element, that could be a violation subject to sanctions and fines on OFAC. So there's a lot of discussion now between insurers and DOJ and their insurers on, can we actually make this payment? And if a carrier has given you, $100,000 in ransomware cover, can they actually pay that and not be in violation of OFAC? That's an ongoing discussion, and more will emerge. And my colleagues at Travelers may have some information on that during their presentation tomorrow. But it's something that we need to pay attention to. And here, think about: is it advisable or even legal to make ransomware payments, and should we concentrate more on spending dollars and providing coverage for securing sites, providing training, and avoiding losses versus and dealing with the consequences? I mean, the best investment against ransomware is backups, and multiple backups in offsite. Those are the types of things that we've talked about for years. When we first started insuring valuable papers and things back when in inland marine and package policy back in the 70s and 80s, is that, hey, a duplicate copy is probably your best insurance against loss. So one of the things that I wanted to focus talk about here is, traditional infrastructure, IT infrastructure, is when we talk about what risk management are thinking about during COVID, and this goes beyond, again, the pandemic, is that there are a lot of things that emanated from it, but we can't lose focus on what really drives losses. And this is claims dollars, time and resources. Those are, property losses aside, because we are seeing weather-induced property claims, an uptick in those, some larger claims. But when we focus on the casualty claims, which are some of the places where we can really have some impact, looking and here I gathered claims data from multiple carriers across multiple jurisdictions, and the picture is pretty much the same. Auto liability in public entities is one of the major drivers of frequency. So it's 58% of the claim count, and it's 39% of the incurred dollars. So both frequency and the total aggregated number of dollars paid. General liability, 27% of the claim count, 25% of the incurred. Public officials, and here in public officials and law enforcement, you'll see that while they are on the lower end of the claim count, they are on the higher end of the severity account. But because by the time these become claims, they become expensive to litigate, and $25,000–$50,000 in litigation expenses for those claims that you see sometimes dismissed on a motion for summary judgment. You're still going to incur significant legal expenses. So when we think about what things we can control and what we need to control, I think we really need to concentrate on those loss drivers. And there are, in fleet safety, David discussed telematics. There have been numerous success stories on how telematics can save both resource costs, just in reducing idle time, in better routing, reducing fuel costs significantly, in being able to look at the analytics from braking, speed, time, again, routes and time of day, et cetera. Using that data to improve loss picture. I think the state of Utah actually has converted a significant amount of their fleet. I saw an example of a water district with a 50-unit fleet that reduced their total claims and operating costs by about $500,000 over a period of 1 year using the telematics, and not tell and get the first thing they had to do was within their employees is build that trust, which was, we're not using this to beat you over the head. We're using it as a time to say, hey, look at the distances that we're following. Look at what the data says on our following distances, on our speed, on our braking, on our aggressive acceleration and deceleration. Look at what these things are telling us, and when our claims occurred, here's how we can, if we take these actions, we can reduce those claims. So in a collaborative method, instead of I'm looking to punish, but what we're looking to do is collaborate and determine how we can act more safely and therefore reduce. And in auto, it is not just the auto liability claim. Many times it's an accompanying workers' compensation claim. We can do a better job by deploying certain technology to help us. So, one of the things I wanted to, I want us all to think about is, what would have happened if this pandemic had occurred in 2000? The difference in, especially the technology that we have and that we can deploy, the ways that we could communicate, both through social media and traditional media, of how we shared information about the pandemic. All of those things, that we should look at the opportunity, the shift that COVID-19 opened the door to a shift, and that we ought to try and go through that door. And these points are just something that again creates ideas. When you look at water resources, and I mentioned using wastewater to identify COVID hotspots. It's also been used to identify places where heavy drug use and address part of the opioid crisis, where we have urban design and how we maintain our streets and roads, our park and our greenways, how it's changing transportation, whether it's from congested downtown areas where office buildings may not come back, and how we reuse that area, how we change parking spaces. All these things that COVID is going to give us the opportunity to do is going to help us find ways to change the impact on our overall risk management, and risk management not just from a financial the financial impact, but from our reputational impact of who we are as communities and how we work together. I think that those are some of the things that we have to look at, is that we're given an opportunity to use some of our risk management techniques to deploy technology to lessen the impact and to create a more resilient community. Because what we've learned, one of the things that we've learned from COVID, it's not just the actions that you take, it's how do you recover from that, and how quickly can you recover, and how quickly can you come back to normal. So it's that resiliency that has to be a watchword in our risk management practices. It's how we become better risk managers. So what do we take away from this? Reprioritize the risk strategy, and this is including your risk appetite. So budgets are going to be stressed. Look at what you insure, how you insure it, deductibles, the self-insured retentions. What is it that I need to pay attention to? And as I've mentioned, some of the basics of how we manage our fleets, our policies and procedures in law enforcement, and our training in law enforcement. That also goes to employment practices, as was mentioned, in harassment training. Those types of things that we can do in infrastructure is and making sure that we prioritize those weak spots that we have in our water and wastewater systems, in our streets and roads, and also in our cyber infrastructure. And then, after as we take care of the basics, is to not lose sight of the emerging risks. Those things, especially where we've learned from COVID, can have a cascading effect and can affect multiple sectors. It's, you know, if there is a loss of service, it doesn't only impact these few citizens in this block. It could, if it has a if there's a facility that is responsible for logistics for a large distributor within our jurisdiction, if that goes down, then that affects other layers of our community. So really looking at things that can affect multiple sectors and when we have coinciding events. Also, that at the forefront of all of our plans is recovery and resilience. Is that how when we do our risk assessment, not only what do we plan to do, but how will that help us down the path to recovery, and how do we most quickly get back into service for our communities? Because that is how we're judged, is that being able to provide that continuing level of essential services and then getting back to normal after an adverse event. So I hope this has been useful. This is these are some reference materials that I used as I tried to think of some of the topics that risk managers were thinking about in this. I don't think we're post-COVID, but as we're on the road to recovery, and they helped me sort of frame some of the things that I wanted to share with you all today. So.
Thanks so much, Tom. Really enjoyed your presentation. A couple of questions came in. Can you comment on the long-term impact in workers' compensation of comorbidity that is occurring due to weight gain that has occurred with many individuals, and the secondary impact of diabetes or related diseases?
You know, as a non-medical professional, I can't comment specifically. What I can share with you is what I've learned during my research for some of these issues that the community leaders are thinking about. The comorbidity during the pandemic, we have there have been, the question is whether the offset of the healthier impact. People have paid more attention to their health. They've gotten out and they've exercised more. I don't know, from where I sit, I look out on my neighborhood street, and over the last year, I've met people I didn't know in the neighborhood, but there are people riding bikes, people walking, people doing it multiple times a day. I think we've seen some healthier aspects of what the pandemic has brought us. But over time, I think with regards to impact on workers' compensation, what we're most concerned about is what are going to be the lingering effects. And I just don't think there's enough data. There's a lot of presumptions that we're making that many people who are affected by COVID have had lingering effects that could influence the length and expense of any workers' compensation claim. However, on that, we're also seeing that with the vaccine, that some of those lingering effects are being quelled when people receive their full dose of vaccine. So, I think it's too soon, but I believe there's sort of that good and bad. We've worked from home I know I've gotten a mouse finger from working from home. I've had to work on my ergonomics, and I know that could in some people lead to workers' compensation claims. But I also know that that we're living somewhat healthier lifestyles that have brought attention to those comorbidity aspects, weight gain, people saying, hey, that puts me at a higher risk. I need to do something about it. So
Okay,
I hope that
and
helps.
yeah. Speaking of working from home, that's the next question, actually. Do you foresee working from home leading to an increase in employment practices claims, such as an application of who's allowed to work from home or who's not allowed to work from home?
Oh, I think that was that indication of, does it become, I think with regards to suits, I think it would come from disability and whether work from home becomes a reasonable accommodation. Several court cases that have been litigated already, and I don't know if all of them have fought their way all the way through the system, indicate that no, that work from home, just because it was allowed during the pandemic and during lockdowns, does not make it now a required reasonable accommodation. I think it's too soon to tell, but I believe that I don't think that we'll see an increase in EEOC claims. Number of claims, again, the evidence shows that in 2020, and again, the time and the delving into the data that says, what does this really mean, hasn't been done. Preliminary says, okay, last year, a lot of us weren't at work, we weren't interacting, we were more concerned about, day to day, that there were fewer claims filed for discrimination, for retaliation, et cetera. The total number of claims went down. But on the other side of the coin, the recoveries went up. The amount of dollars spent on EEOC claims went up. I think looking into the crystal ball, I think as we return to work, just because of the nature of human interactions, that we may see those numbers go back to the same level. But it's kind of like the thing that went on with discussing the dire predictions of finances. And again, I'm not minimizing the effect on especially there's certain individual communities that have been severely impacted, both jobs, resources, revenues, et cetera. I don't want to minimize that. But the dire predictions that were made did not come to fruition because there were so many other moving parts that either smoothed that sort of smoothed out some of those losses in revenues. I want to say that there's probably going to be that same thing, whether it's workers' compensation, EPLI, et cetera, where it's a balancing. This rises, this decreases, and there's a balancing act. So overall, I don't think that the lasting COVID impact with regards to specific lines of business, et cetera, is going to be too long lasting. I think what we can make long lasting is what it made us realize in how we handle risk and how we perceive risk and how we deal with it and how we deal with our risk assessments.
All right, and one more question for you. Do you feel that the social isolation has also contributed to greater social unrest, and how can risk managers address this?
Now I'm gonna go back to my philosophy degree. I actually think that isolation, and if I look out my window, I see a sign that one of my neighbors has in the yard that they got from their local church, isolated but not alone. I think during this time, while I'm here in my office, I don't have coworkers around me, but in many ways, I'm more connected to my coworkers because I've had to make an effort to pick up the phone, to ping somebody, to send a message, whatever it is. I don't think that the social isolation is going to drive any additional breakdown in society. I actually think that it's the converse, that we become more connected as communities, which is why I was talking about open meetings and community involvement and communication and why that's so important. I think we've become better at it. And despite the noise and the frustrations, I mean, my daughter has had to deal with adults yelling at 16-year-old staffers about mask wearing at a soccer game for 6-year-olds. That kind of animosity and stuff that's out there, I truly believe that in a lasting, as we go forward, that those are isolated incidents, and that as risk managers, we're learning to deal with them. I think risk managers at retail stores have, as mask mandates change, have told their employees, yes, people must still wear masks, but don't challenge them. Whereas at the beginning of the pandemic, people were being challenged. You cannot come in. Risk managers said, hey, it's not worth the blowback. It's your safety. It's not worth my employee's safety to confront somebody at this point when there's no winning the argument. So again, there's isolation, social interaction, the way we deal with people. I think, again, that good and bad, that thing where we've learned a lot of lessons. And I think in the grand scheme of things, it's going to benefit us. We're going to be better risk managers. Again, I think evaluating risk. What is the risk to me personally to go out and interact with somebody? What is that co-risk if I protect not me, but somebody else when I wear a mask? Whatever it is, getting beyond political, scientific, everything, but just personal interaction. How do I best deal with the person next to me, coworker, friend, neighbor, whatever? I think it's been enhanced. And not so much by isolation, but simply by the mechanisms that we've had to use to connect with each other, stay connected, and go forward, and concurrently how we've had to change our thinking about, what's risky and what's not risky. We used to, the same thing that we had to do when we first started, I know, when I had to transition from never wearing a seatbelt because my parents' car didn't have them to wearing a seatbelt. What do we do? How do we evaluate risk, and how do we deal with that? So I could go on for that, but I'll stop.
No, really appreciate it, Tom. Thank you again for your presentation.
Thank you all. I appreciate the opportunity.
We have enjoyed the presentations today. I know I've taken a lot of notes and enjoyed the thoughtful consideration that our presenters have made today. We'd like to thank them for their work. They've spent a lot of time and a lot of energy putting this information out to us. We want to remind all those who have been part of this that the Utah Bar will provide CLE credit, and the Utah Insurance Department is providing continuing education credit. But to do so, you need to register at riskconference.net. The information today, the sessions have been recorded, and many of the presenters have also made their slides available so that you can review those independently of the presentation as well. We appreciate everyone staying with us. I know it's a little bit of a long slog to take in this much information in this short of time. We appreciate your involvement, and we look forward to having you part of the second part of our Spring Risk Conference, which will occur on Thursday morning at the same time at 8:20. Until then, we'll go ahead and sign off, and we'll look forward to seeing you on Thursday. Thanks.